I'm Dr. Chris Masterjohn of chrismasterjohnphd.com, and you're listening to episode 65 of Mastering Nutrition. This is the March 8th, 2019 recording of the Ask Me Anything About Nutrition live Zoom session that I held with members of the CMJ Masterpass who asked me questions, and I answered them.
This is Mastering Nutrition with Chris Masterjohn. Take control of your health, master the science, and apply it like a pro. Are you ready?
In this episode, we talk about questions such as, should blacks and whites have different normal ranges for their HDL cholesterol? What about getting nauseated from zinc supplements, even at low doses, and even when the zinc comes as oysters? Someone on a ketogenic diet, is it a problem that her ketones are 2 to 3 millimoles per liter, but going up to 5 to 6 millimoles per liter? Should she try to mess with her ratios in order to get those ketone levels back down to 2 to 3 millimoles per liter? What causes sinus congestion and what can help? For the MTHFR polymorphisms that are not the famous C677T or the A1298C, do they matter at all? What about nutrition for children with ADHD? We talk about choline, we talk about alpha-GPC, we talk about different roles that dopamine play and how to modulate it. We talk about the importance of glycine as a buffer of too many methyl groups, and we talk about Gaba. We talk about a little about orthostatic hypotension and regulation of blood pressure. We talk about single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, in the MTR and MTRR genes, which are related to MTHFR but are not MTHFR and are related more to B12 and B12 recycling. Are there any nutritional recommendations that we can do around that? We talk a little bit about my new Vitamins and Minerals 101 class, free 30-day class to educate you on each of the essential nutrients. We talk about nutrition for breast cancer. We talk about why hyperglycemia, why the main problem is not glucose, but is rather advanced glycation end products, and why the main determinant of advanced glycation end products is not about the glucose level rising, although that plays a minor and important role. The primary role is about low insulin signaling, even in people who have high blood levels of insulin. Is it useful to measure your urine pH? Does the difference between cyanocobalamin and hydroxycobalamin and methylcobalamin matter? Does the difference between sublingual, oral, and intramuscular injection matter? Are there safety concerns, and specifically, are there safety concerns specifically with MTHFR? This leads me to go off on a rant about why I believe that many people use MTHFR to slap a label on their health problems, and how that is getting in the way. Even though I believe that it is valuable to measure MTHFR genes, I believe that it is used as a way to slap a label on deeper problems that many people are not addressing. Are bilirubin and uric acid useful markers of antioxidant defense and oxidative stress? What do I think are better markers? What if I'm on a ketogenic diet and I can't get my ketone levels up that high, higher than 1 millimole per liter, when my primary reason for being on the ketogenic diet is that I'm trying to control blood glucose better? Could fat malabsorption be driven by the genetic polymorphisms that lower the PEMT enzyme? And could fat malabsorption in general be causing not only mineral deficiencies, but also hyperabsorption of oxalate from foods? How to manage blood levels of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids? Why am I always sneezing first thing in the morning? What if I cannot get my ferritin up and supplementing iron actually raises my serum iron well above the normal range? What about pyroluria and measuring cryptopyrroles? How to balance hypercholesterolemia and insulin resistance and poor glucose tolerance in someone by modulating the fat and carbohydrate content of the diet. What to do in general about high fasting glucose that only seems to improve with extra long sleep. And then finally, what should be the upper limit of fatty fish intake, and should there be one? The answers to these questions coming up shortly. First, a word from my sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by Ample. Ample is incredible. It's a meal in a bottle that takes a total of 2 minutes to prepare, consume, and clean up. 2 minutes. I'm not kidding. Now, I know what you're thinking. Anything that quick just has to be made of synthetic ingredients that you'd have a hard time pronouncing and wouldn't want to put into your body. But it's not. Ample is made entirely from natural ingredients and designed to provide an optimal balance between protein, fat, and carbs, as well as all the vitamins and minerals that you'd need in a single meal. There's no question that it's always best to sit down and take your time eating a home-cooked meal from fresh ingredients. But let's face it, oftentimes we just don't have time for that. If you live a busy life like I do and your goal is to get things done, you need quality fuel that you can get into your system quickly. Here's a great example where Ample is perfect for me. When I shoot videos, it takes hours to set up and break down all of my equipment. So I try to get as many videos shot in a day as possible. This prevents wasting a lot of time on setup and helps me conserve big blocks of time outside of shooting videos to get into a flow state where I can research something to my heart's content and spend all the time I need thinking about it creatively and analytically. But if I spend hours dealing with recording equipment plus hours spent preparing food, eating it, and cleaning up, there's no time left over to actually shoot any videos. So on recording days, I use Ample to maximize efficiency and focus on getting things done. Ample comes in 3 versions: original, keto, and vegan. And each version comes in 2 portion sizes: 400 calorie and 600 calorie. The 600 calorie original version gives me 37 grams of protein from a mix of grass-fed whey and collagen, which promotes satiety and flips my brain on. Its fat comes from coconut oil and macadamia nut oil. I like these oils because they're low in polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, oils that promote aging and are usually loaded into the processed foods that most people eat when they need something on the go. The coconut oil provides some medium-chain fats to keep my energy levels up, too. The carbs, the vitamins, and the minerals all come exclusively from food sources like sweet potatoes, bananas, cocoa powder, wheat and barley grass, and chlorella. It's full of natural prebiotic fibers and probiotics to promote a healthy microbiome, and the gentle sweetness comes from a mix of honey, monk fruit, and stevia. I just mix it with water, drink it, rinse out the bottle, and boom, 2 minutes in, and I'm fully fueled and ready to face the next phase of the day. I first came across Ample when I met its founder and CEO, Connor Young, at PaleoFX a few years ago. Connor inspired me with his vision for Ample, which I anticipate will be much more than a meal in a bottle in the near future. I've become an official advisor to Ample, and I'll be helping Ample design scientific research that will lead both to an ever-improving Ample and, I hope, meaningful contributions to our understanding of how to use nutrition to help people be healthier and happier and perform better at the challenges that they care most about. As a listener to the Mastering Nutrition podcast, I've also worked out a special deal for you. If you use the discount code CHRIS15, you'll get 15% off your first order of Ample. To get your discount, go to amplemeal.com. That's amplemeal.com, 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 and use the code CHRIS15 at checkout. This episode is brought to you by Ancestral Supplements. Traditional peoples, Native Americans, and early ancestral healers believed that eating the organs from a healthy animal would strengthen and support the health of the corresponding organ of the individual. For example, the traditional way of treating a person with a weak heart was to feed the person the heart of a healthy animal. Modern science makes sense of this. Heart is uniquely rich in coenzyme Q10, which supports heart health. The importance of eating organs, though, is much broader than simply matching the organ you eat to the organ you want to nourish. For example, natives of the Arctic had very limited access to plant foods and got their vitamin C from adrenal glands. And vitamin C is important to far more parts of your body than simply your adrenals. In his epic work, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, Weston Price recorded a story of natives who cured blindness using eyeballs, which are very rich in vitamin A. But now that we understand vitamin A, we know that we can get even more vitamin A by eating liver, making liver good for your eyes. Our ancestors made liberal use of organ meats both to be economical and to utilize their healing and nourishing properties. Animals in the wild do the same. Weston Price had also recorded a story of how the zoos in his era were capturing lions, tigers, and leopards, oh my, only to watch them become infertile in captivity. Researchers then observed what the lions did when they killed zebras in the wild. What they did was they went straight for the organs and bone marrow, leaving the muscle meat behind for the birds. But even the birds took what they could of the organs and bone marrow. Price reported that once the zookeepers started feeding the animals organ meats, boom, their fertility returned. The problem I often encounter, though, is that many people just don't like eating organ meats. Let's face it, if you weren't raised on them, it can be very hard to acquire a taste for them. That is where Ancestral comes in. Ancestral Supplements has a nose-to-tail product line of grass-fed liver, organ meats, living collagen, bone marrow, and more, all in the convenience of a gelatin capsule. For more information or to buy any of their products, go to ancestralsupplements.com. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out.
All right, welcome back everybody to the next of the AMAs. People are starting to drop in. I'm sure there's many of you who've been here before and a couple of you at least who haven't. And so just as a reminder, we ask questions in one of two ways, either in the Q&A or by raising your hand. If you raise your hand, that is to ask a question using audio or video. And if you ask in the chat, that's to ask your question by chat. By Q&A. In the Q&A section, I will turn on it so that everyone can see everyone else's questions as I go through them. And if you want to respond to other people's questions by text as I'm answering them, or before I answer them, reply to that question. Don't use the chat for that. But if someone comes on screen by raising their hand, then the only way that you can add to the conversation would be to say something in the chat. So that will be the one time that we use the chat. Please don't use the chat for questions or I will start missing them. Ellie says, hey, Chris. Hey, Ellie. Okay. Also, I will answer you are free to ask your question anonymously, but I will basically be following a format where I will answer in an effort to make sure that I'm answering everyone's questions. I will not answer someone's question a second time until I answer everyone else's questions. And so I'm more likely to answer your question faster if you don't ask it anonymously, simply because I'm going to treat all the anonymous questions as anonymous and then treat each individually named person as themselves. Okay. Anonymous says, given that black people tend to have higher HDL and lower triglycerides than white people, should their targets for lipids be any different? For example, should they aim for a total to HDL cholesterol ratio of less than 3? That is an excellent question. However, I don't know the answer to it, and I have not done adequate research into the interracial differences between lipid levels. I will say, as a general principle and not as a specific response to this question, but as a general principle, I think it's very important to realize that racial differences are usually differences in averages in those groups, and that it's super important to treat everyone as an individual. So, and actually, I think this is a generally applicable thing to the whole concept of normal ranges throughout medicine and nutrition, which is that even if we're not talking about differences between different races, even if we're just talking about the normal range for the general population, or even if we get into the normal range for blacks, the normal ranges for white, the normal range for men, the normal range for women, it's still the case that no matter what analysis we use, all we're doing when we establish a normal range is to establish the normal range for the population, not for the individual. And so it's always the case that individuals within any group may have very different normal ranges for themselves. And so on the one hand, it's good that we have normal ranges like that because we want to get a sense of the probability that someone has a particular issue. But when I look at blood lipids, remember, I'm not a medical doctor, right? So I'm not diagnosing people and I'm not treating people. What I'm trying to do is understand the physiology of what's going on. So when I'm looking at something like the total to HDL cholesterol ratio, if I see that it's different in blacks and whites, my first question is going to be why. And because I have not researched this, I can't answer that question. But I wouldn't jump to the assumption that necessarily just because the average is different for blacks and whites that we therefore should assume that we should change the normal range. In other words, if blacks have a higher HDL cholesterol ratio, does that just mean that they are relatively more protected against heart disease than whites because of their higher HDL cholesterol ratio, HDL cholesterol amount? Or does it mean that they need a higher HDL cholesterol in order to get the same amount of protection from heart disease as white people have? And you can't even begin to unravel that without getting into the mechanisms, which it may well be the case that other people have done, but because I haven't done those, because I haven't done the research into that, I'm not really qualified to address it directly. But I think those are some of the general principles that we should be keeping in mind when we're thinking about interracial differences or differences between any groups. Thank you for your question. And a reminder to myself that I will collect these while we're doing it instead of afterwards to make the show notes efficient. All right, Ellie Zainoun says, zinc, exclamation point. I get nauseated even from the low-dose supplements you recommend with copper. I also get nauseated from oysters. Any solutions around that? Ellie, I think that, well, actually, if you could clarify for me as a reply to your question in the Q&A, what is the context of how you're consuming the oysters? Are you consuming an oyster with nothing else, or are you consuming the oysters with a meal? So I know that my general recommendation is, so she gets nauseated by oysters with food. That's very interesting. And I'm not, so let me give my response to the zinc, which is simple. And then we can try to judge whether it's likely the same issue with the oysters. So with the zinc, my general recommendation is to take zinc on an empty stomach. First of all, because the thing that is not controversial is that phytate is the principal inhibitor of zinc absorption. And phytate is found in whole grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes. And so I think there's very broad agreement across the zinc research community that taking zinc with not with a meal that contains whole grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes is going to lead to higher zinc absorption. And then there's some controversy. Does it matter whether the zinc is on an empty stomach compared to a phytate-free meal, which would be a meal that doesn't have any whole grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes? And because there's a gray area there, I say if you can, take it on an empty stomach. If you can't, take it with a phytate-free meal. And so generally, it's the case that if someone takes 15 milligrams of zinc with a full glass of water, they are very unlikely to get nauseated from it. Whereas if almost anyone takes 50 milligrams of zinc with a full glass of water on an empty stomach, they're almost definitely going to get nauseated from it. I would get nauseated from it. And so taking the low dose should allow you to take it on an empty stomach. But for some people like Ellie, she does get nauseated, even taking only 15 milligrams on an empty stomach. So what I would say is figure out the lowest amount of food. Well, you have two options. So the ideal thing would be figure out the lowest amount of food that it takes to, I'm sorry. This is, this is a he, not a she. Sorry about that. Is it Ellie or is it Eli? Anyway. So anyway, the first approach is Ellie. Okay, perfect. So the first approach, Ellie, is that you want to try to see does a little bit of bone broth or a little bit of juice or a little bite of food or something little like that. Does that allow you to take a small dose of zinc without nausea? If it does, then I would do that on the basis that it might be better absorbed. But if your meals are primarily phytate free, then it's not that big a deal to take it with the meal if it's making you sick to take it away from the meal. So I would just, in your case, I would say just take the 50 milligrams of zinc with the meal. And then, judge that based on how effective it is. Maybe the absorption is less, maybe. But in terms of whether that matters, you're looking at are you able to get your plasma zinc up to where you want it if you're testing? If you're not testing, do you have any symptoms of zinc deficiency, and can you effectively get rid of them by taking the zinc with a meal? So that's what I would do. I don't know about the oysters. I mean, the oysters, there can be other things in the oysters that are making you nauseated. There could be histamine, there could be viruses, there's a lot of things in oysters. So I think oysters are amazing food if they don't make you sick, but sometimes oysters make you sick. So I would apply the same exact principle to the oysters. If you eat the oyster at the end of a phytate-free meal, is it still making you sick? If so, I don't think that's the zinc. I think it's something else, and your digestive system might not be up to the task of eating oysters right now at this moment. But if at the end of a phytate-free meal, if you can fit in 1 or 2 oysters and doesn't make you nauseated at all, then I think that's great. And, oysters are probably the ideal zinc supplement if you can get them in. So you would probably want to have a couple a day, but that a couple of oysters a day goes a long way to getting your zinc in. Thanks, Ellie, for your question. Tiana Talent says, a friend of mine has been on a ketogenic diet for the last 3 weeks. Initially, her ketone levels were 2 to 3 millimoles per liter, but the last few days they have been up to around 5 to 6 millimoles per liter. Her macros are 80 grams of protein, 20 grams of net carbs, 130 grams of fat. What could make ketones this high? Are there any concerns for them being at this level? Those are the normal fasting levels of ketones at, a normal fat, a normal long-term fast. So I don't know. I know that some people in the keto, and actually this was in one of the previous AMAs. I forget who it was. I don't want to misstate the person's name. One of the popular ketogenic advocates was saying that if the ketones are getting above 3, then it's from not eating enough protein. I don't really see it that way. I think that protein will suppress ketogenesis, and so will carbs. 5 to 6 millimoles per liter is what you see in therapeutic ketogenic diets. And so I think the real question is, what is this doing to her health? And I don't see any obvious threat to her health on the basis of the ketones alone. And so I think you have to judge that against, is she experiencing any health problems or is she feeling better? And I think those would be the primary things. In terms of how you could bring the ketones down, more carbs or more protein are going to bring them down. Between the two of those, probably protein would be the most important thing to increase as a means of protection against lean mass loss and as a means of keeping neurotransmitters and all the other things that you do with protein healthy. But you could raise the carbs a little bit too, because remember that your carb demand even on a ketogenic diet is definitely not down to 20 grams of carbs. That's not even feeding your brain on the ketogenic diet. So, if you have room to increase carbs, then I think it would be great to get the carbs up to at least 30, and then maybe use protein going up to supply the rest of that. And then also pay attention to micronutrients. If do a dietary analysis, if there are certain nutrients that this person's not really getting in, that come from more vegetables would help those micronutrients, then increase the vegetables and the carbs along with them for that purpose. But just on macros alone, I would say go up at least 10 grams on the carbs, and go up to, if you can get there, 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight on the protein, and that'll bring the ketones down. Thanks, Tiana, for your question. By the way, someone had their hand raised, and I was going to get to you after I answered this question, and now I do not. Oh, wait, the hand is still raised. Okay. Alejandra, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I had my sound off. Do you want to come on screen?
Sure. I don't know how to do that though.
Okay, I just promoted you to a panelist, and so if you have your webcam on, we'll be able to see you. If you don't, then I can't help with that.
I'm not sure.
Okay, it's all right.
Okay,
we'll just do it by audio. What's up?
So my husband had what is called a transient ischemic attack a month ago.
Okay. Now we see him. Oh, wait, I can't hear you. Hold on.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, perfect. Okay.
Okay, so
your husband had a transient ischemic attack?
A month ago. And it seems like he had a very small thing in his brain. And he was smoking and drinking. He stopped already.
Okay.
He still has pins and needles feeling on his right-hand side of his body. He's recovering from his leg. He has recovered his leg sensation in his leg, but he still has the this feeling in his right-hand side and face. So is there, he did a little bit of the paleo diet with me. He goes on and off. He's going to do it more. He has a little bit of cholesterol, just not much, and he has a little bit of high blood pressure. He has one kidney. Besides that, I think he's okay.
Okay. And what's your question?
So the question is,
I'm sorry that you're going through that, but
yeah, I know.
What can we do?
Okay, so first, if you know of a doctor, a different kind of doctor that you can advise to see, and if you can give like a general ideas of nutrition or like a general idea to start looking into.
Sure. I can't help on the doctor front. I mean, I certainly know some people who are who I talk to about nutrition a lot, but I think when you're talking about this, then you want to find the intersection of that with someone who really specializes in the condition. And I don't know, and I just don't know enough doctors who are doing that kind of work. Hold on. I saw someone saying that they lost sound. Could other people? Can someone in the chat let us know whether you can still hear both of us? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So it was a temporary sound glitch, but it's back. Okay. Perfect. Okay. What I can say though is that
although I'm not an expert in the specific condition of the transient ischemic attack, ischemia is when the blood supply gets cut off. And it's very, very similar to what is happening in a heart attack, where, and the reasons for these events differ in different people, but in general, the most common reason for what we think of as a heart attack is ischemia, but it's in the coronary arteries. And also an ischemic stroke is a larger event. A TIA, a transient ischemic attack, is like a mini stroke. But they all kind of fall into the same category, where the development of plaque is a very significant part, is the major thing predisposing you to having an event like that. And I know in my grandmother had a transient ischemic attack, and she was very lucky to have the TIA, because when she was in the hospital for it, they realized that she had a 97% blockage in her coronary arteries, and they fixed that, and she could have wound up with a fatal heart attack otherwise. So I tell that only to illustrate the parallels of how, if that happens, you probably have atherosclerosis going on. And so probably, and certainly it's the case that getting the blood pressure under control is going to be another very important factor. But I think nutritionally, the major factors in blood pressure are potassium is the biggest one, the salt to potassium ratio, not eating too much. Some people are salt sensitive, some aren't. But the major factor is really the salt to potassium ratio. Some of the other minerals like magnesium and calcium are important. But then stress and physical activity are huge in blood pressure as well. So assuming that's under control, the main nutritional factors that you want to pay attention to are things that get the blood lipids under control, and then things that get the process of calcification and inflammation under control. And really, you could copy and paste a protocol for dealing with protection against heart disease onto this. And basically that means, so let's I'll do the non-cholesterol stuff first, because that's the less obvious stuff. So vitamin K2 is very important for protecting the blood vessels from calcification. Magnesium is important, and vitamin A is important. So are these things familiar to you, or should I talk about how to get
No, I do.
You are familiar with these. Okay. Yes. So I think those are the big nutrient factors when we're thinking about calcification. But then the blood lipids is super important too. So you mentioned his cholesterol. What is that like?
Very, very little. No, I don't have the figure.
Or it's high, but not that high.
It's a little bit high only. It's a little bit high.
Okay.
Really high.
All right. So maybe the cholesterol isn't his main factor. So yeah, what you really want to think about these different. I would say the other thing is antioxidant protection. So the reason that the lipids are problematic is because they're getting damaged by free radicals and other damaging molecules. So things like vitamin C and E, glutathione, fruits and vegetables supplying polyphenols, all the minerals like zinc, copper, iron, manganese, selenium, all those things are important. So it's really
from natural sources, preferably.
Well, preferably what's his diet like? Because preferably what you want is to...
Well, it used to be pasta every day with, like an Italian kind of... That's what it used to be.
So look, figuring out whatever the limiting factor is and managing the details is a really big project. Like there are some simple rules of thumb, like start getting regular exercise, providing that the doctor okays it. Obviously with cardiovascular issues you have to do that, but whatever is safe for him to engage in, if needed, meditation or stress reduction on the blood pressure, and then just cut the junk food out and include a well-balanced diet. That's the simple thing, right? if you want to go deeper than that, then you really need to start looking at more comprehensively about, is he missing any nutrients?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that a simple way to do that is who makes his food? Is it you or is it?
I make the food, yeah.
So if you make the food, then put what you're making into Chronometer, which is a food tracking app.
Okay.
Do it correctly. See if there's any missing nutrients that stand out. That's the simplest way to say, like, geez, maybe he's missing something. Other than that, if you really want to dig into the case, you need to do a lot of testing. But if you're in control of the food, just starting by analyzing what you're feeding him and seeing what's missing.
Well, the thing is that I cook and then he orders some days and some days. You know what I mean?
Right. So that's a behavioral management issue.
What I mean is that, he's going to see your video after this. So, okay.
All right. Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Alejandra.
Now, the only thing is he still has the pains and needles. Is there anything to recover cells or, for the recovery of whatever happened in the brain?
Yeah. Let me pull up something that I haven't published it, but I wrote up some notes on things that seem to be important for nerve regeneration. So let me pull that up because I can. Okay, so what I have in my notes on nutritional impacts on this is you're getting ready for a big recipe here. So iron, phosphorus, and sulfate are very important for regenerating nerves. Magnesium. Acetylcholine is a major factor in regeneration of nerves, and so choline is important. If you were to use a supplement, alpha GPC would be the ideal choline supplement to use because it's superior at generating acetylcholine. Vitamin A and zinc are very important for nerve regeneration. DHA, which is one of the omega-3 fatty acids that you find in fish, is very important. Vitamin B6 and possibly Gaba supplementation could help.
So at the moment you're not giving any
magnesium, if I didn't say that.
So at the moment you're not giving any consultations, correct?
At the moment I'm booked up till I'm completely booked for the rest of the year.
Okay. All right.
Why don't you go back with these notes, see what you do with it, and then show up in the next AMA when you figure out what the gaps in our understanding are.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Alejandra. Okay, Anita, Anita, are you there? Okay, I have an Anita who's, one second, guys, sorry. Okay, Anita, I may have accidentally made you a panelist. If I did, I'm sorry. Raise your hand again if you actually wanted to show up there. Okay. Anita says, what foods can cause sinus congestion? What can help congestion? Well, I think that's kind of complicated because congestion could be an allergic response. And so any kind of food allergies would be a possible candidate for that. But in terms of what is generally good for congestion, I would say that anything that promotes glutathione synthesis and recycling is going to be very important for protecting against congestion. I say that on the basis that in the extracellular lung fluid, and this is probably true in the nasal cavity as well. I'm not 100% sure on that. But this is definitely true for lung congestion. I think it might be true for sinus congestion as well. Wherever you have mucus, the principal determinant of how fluid that mucus is versus how stuck together it is the glutathione level in the mucus. And that's because mucus forms disulfide bonds, and when mucus proteins form disulfide bonds, they stick together. And so congestion is not just that. You also have inflammatory expansion of the sinuses, and you have and then you have whatever's driving the inflammation as huge factors there. But as a general blanket recommendation, I would say trying to boost glutathione status would be a good way to try to nutritionally make mucus more fluid. And when we talk about that, we're talking about getting enough protein. We're talking about magnesium. We're talking about several B vitamins, especially thiamine, niacin, and riboflavin. We are talking about getting enough glycine. The protein, specifically in whey protein, can, if that's not causing an allergy, can be very helpful in boosting glutathione status. And then also the polyphenols in fruits and vegetables can be very helpful in boosting glutathione status. And then if all else fails, you can always supplement with N-acetylcysteine, or my preference is glutathione or liposomal glutathione to see if any of those things help. But that's just working on the mucus fluidity. The rest of that comes down to what's causing the inflammation. And I suspect that that's more often than not a highly individualized question rather than a general one. For example, it could be a food allergy. It could be a sinus infection. Too many possibilities to make blanket statements. But I would say the blanket statement on that front is look for the specific cause of the inflammation in order to start addressing it. All right. Thank you, Anita, for your question. Chris Morell says, Chris, question about MTHFR. I don't have the C677T polymorphism, but I do have other MTHFR mutations, including homozygous G1958A, heterozygous A1298C, and A66G, and also homozygous bunch of other numbers. The latter perhaps makes sense when I reduce carbs and LDL shoots up. I've read this polymorphism is also often associated with LDL regulation. Would your advice on riboflavin supplementation work for me, or would I need a different approach? Thanks, Chris. I have to say that I just have not done the research on those specific polymorphisms. And that's the case because in the research that I have done, I was not given the impression that the mechanistic underpinnings of what those polymorphisms do is known. And I might be wrong. And if I am wrong, then I would encourage anyone who knows that I'm wrong to send me the research on that. But one of the reasons that I use the strategy report instead of some of the other reports that look at polymorphisms in the methylation pathways is because I think Ben Lynch did a good job ignoring a lot of the stuff where we just don't know exactly what action they're doing. And I believe that those polymorphisms fit into that category. But certainly, Chris, if you find out information indicating that I still have some homework to do on that, then please send it to me. I'll take a look at it. Mindy says, looking for suggestions for a child with ADHD. We already use glycine for sleep, mostly successfully, still tweaking dose. Should we do that in the morning too? What about tyrosine in the morning? We are working on keeping choline levels up, 3 ounces of liver per week on average. Just added some supplemental riboflavin. Too soon for a report. Anything else to provide nutritional support? Mindy, I have to confess that I haven't done a lot of research into ADHD yet. But what I would say based on what I think I know about it is that, first of all, a lot of Carl says my microphone has fallen. If anyone, a couple people are saying it sounds clear. Oh, is it? Can a couple people confirm that the sound is better now? Okay, everyone says it's better now. Okay, thank you. Mindy, I would say that one thing that you could experiment with would be Gaba. And I don't know the doses to experiment with, but I do know that in adults, 100 to 800 milligrams per day has been used in a couple studies showing effects in the brain. I say that because one of the things that's going wrong in ADHD is that the brain is not getting dopamine's signal that something is valuable enough to start paying attention to it. Or no, I shouldn't say that, to keep paying attention to it. And based on the drugs that are used to treat ADHD, it seems like the problem might be best characterized as generally low dopamine, because it seems like the drugs that, I should back up for a second. So when we talk about dopamine, and this is a simplification, but I think it's a good one. When we talk about dopamine, there's two areas of the brain where it's really relevant to determining what you're paying attention to and how strong the hold is on your attention. In the frontal cortex, which is controlling a lot of our decision making, basically the more dopamine you have there, the more steady your focus is on something. So in that area of the brain, more dopamine is generally going to be more focused, and less dopamine is going to mean less focus. But a huge, huge factor in actually making the decisions of what to focus on are in the basal ganglia, which is kind of like if you traced through here into the middle of your head, it's like sitting there at the base of that big wrinkly extension that has the frontal cortex in it. And the basal ganglia there is using it's using dopamine in two different ways. There's a tonic amount of dopamine that's always there that just sort of sets the baseline tone. And then there's little tiny pulses of dopamine that last milliseconds, that the spikes are caused by almost anything that is possibly worthy of your attention. And there has to be a certain threshold to cross. But as a general principle, so there might be things that like are just under your perception, or because of the way your brain's wired, certain things that do cross your attention, but they don't produce any dopamine spike because they just don't cross the threshold of how valuable they are to pay attention to it. But as a general rule, almost anything is going to make one of these phasic pulses of dopamine. And the background level of dopamine, the baseline tonic dopamine in the basal ganglia, sets the tone of how big of a pulse do you need in order for something to be worthy of your attention. And so if the tonic level of dopamine is high, then those phasic pulses look smaller. And so the brain is less likely to judge something as worthy of attention. And because of that, it's more likely to stay focused on whatever it has been focused on. The opposite thing is that if the tonic
level of dopamine in the basal ganglia is low, then it's really easy for a spike to come in and grab the attention of the brain, because the baseline is so low that no matter how big that spike is, it looks really significant to the brain. So that's more like what's happening in ADHD, because in ADHD, even if you put your attention onto something, the next thing is just as grabbing. Like it's harder to focus on something because everything coming at you could be equally worthy of grabbing your attention. So I think that the drugs that are used to treat ADHD are acting on both of those pools. They're increasing the tonic level of dopamine in the frontal cortex, and they're increasing the tonic level of dopamine in the basal ganglia. In the frontal cortex, the increased dopamine is basically making more stable mental states. So if you focus on something, you will hold on to that better. In the basal ganglia, increasing the tonic dopamine is making it harder for a new thing to grab your attention, which reinforces the fact that you are more focused. So anything that increases dopamine is going to be good. There's that. And in the basal ganglia, the tonic level of dopamine is primarily controlled by methylation. Now, it's true that if you just overall underproduce dopamine, that you'll have a low tonic level of dopamine in the basal ganglia, but you also don't want to overmethylate the dopamine pool, because if you do, then you will reduce the tonic level of dopamine there, which is not what you want in ADHD. And so you don't want to do anything that is going to overmethylate. And the top thing that prevents overmethylation is the glycine. So one of Mindy's questions is, should I just use the glycine to promote sleep, or should I also use it in the morning? And I would say, ultimately, you have to judge it based on the results you get, but you should try it at other times during the day, because one of the roles of glycine would be to provide the buffer against excess methylation. And that's going to be one of the things that will help the tonic level of dopamine in the basal ganglia to rise up. And actually, that's true in the frontal cortex too. So both in the frontal cortex, in both pools that we're talking about, preventing overmethylation will help the dopamine level to rise. Now, the second thing that becomes important is that in the basal ganglia, the way that dopamine signals in the phasic pulse, the way that dopamine signals that something new is worthy of attention. And if we're talking about the first thing to pay attention to, like he needs to work on schoolwork in the morning, that's the first thing he's paying attention to. This aspect of that is going to be important. The way that it signals that is to overcome a tonic level of Gaba that suppresses paying attention to everything else. To restate that in maybe a simpler way, for dopamine to make you pay attention to something that has value, you must have Gaba suppressing attention to everything else. And dopamine cannot be a meaningful signal of the value of placing attention on something unless you have adequate Gaba to suppress your attention paid to everything else. Because if you're paying attention to your schoolwork while you are also paying attention to your video games and to the mosquito in the corner equally as much, then you're not actually paying attention to your schoolwork. So I think that anything that would boost Gaba would be helpful. And I think that, so yes to the glycine during the day. Yes, you do want to keep choline levels up, but remember that choline is a methyl donor. And so you don't want to, so choline is a double-edged sword here. First of all, the choline is needed for acetylcholine. And when dopamine tells you to pay attention to something, once you're paying attention, you need acetylcholine to get to sustain your attention on that thing and get results. So dopamine is the signal that that thing has value to pay attention to. Acetylcholine is what you actually use to pay attention to it and get results. So you do want to help his acetylcholine levels, but you have to remember that choline is a methyl donor, and that the more choline you have, the more important it becomes that the glycine is kept high enough to buffer excess methylation. Otherwise, choline could act as a double-edged sword and potentially wind up reducing dopamine levels. If that appears to be a problem, you might want to try alpha-GPC supplementation to get the acetylcholine, because alpha-GPC is dramatically directed towards acetylcholine boosting rather than toward methylation, whereas every other choline is far more likely to play a role in methylation than it is to play a role in boosting acetylcholine. So experimenting with alpha-GPC would be one thing instead of choline. But if you are just making sure that food sources of choline are high, which is the more natural thing to do, and which is what I think you should do if you get results from it, then it becomes very, very, very important to pay attention to the glycine. The other thing that I would add is the Gaba. Maybe start at 100 milligrams a day and work your way up to 800, and just be careful with the low dose. See what results you get. If it seems promising, try increasing the dose. And then also, I'll post the link in the show notes, and let me make a note here to do that, to an episode of Chris Masterjohn Light that I did on how to make your own Gaba. So there's a lot that could be said about that, but I'll just refer you to that, and I'll post a link to that in the show notes. All right, I thank you, Mindy, for your question. I hope that helped. Gary Krieger says, how to address orthostatic hypotension with high resting blood pressure, 140 to 160 over 75 to 85. Saliva cortisol shows high morning cortisol, low afternoon, normal evening. Also, I'm slightly hypothyroid. Thank you. I don't think that I'm a very good person to address this. So I would check your B12 levels, because B12 deficiency can cause autonomic dysfunction. And so that is something that I know about, but I don't know enough about how nutrition intersects with the more normal and common causes of orthostatic hypotension. That is definitely worthy of my attention, but not something that I feel competent to address right now. I do think that it makes sense to look at nutritional effects that might reduce your high resting blood pressure. As I mentioned before, when Alejandra was on screen, potassium first and foremost, seeing if you're salt sensitive, and then some of the other minerals, especially calcium and magnesium, would be things that I would look at there. Sorry, I can't answer your question in more detail, Gary, but I hope that provided some value to you. Miles Nichols says, do you have any info on MTR and MTRR polymorphisms? Are these clinically relevant? Do they warrant methylcobalamin supplementation or injections? Are there other considerations like glycine, choline, and creatine that are important in the cases of MTR and MTRR mutations? Okay, Miles, let me stop and give a little bit of background for everyone. So in the methylation cycle, I've talked a lot about MTHFR, which helps finalize the methyl group of methylfolate, but then folate has to donate that methyl group to vitamin B12 in order for vitamin B12 to donate it to homocysteine. And in that process, that's how you clear homocysteine, primarily in the fasting state rather than the fed state. And it's also how you recycle homocysteine to methionine to use for methylation, again, primarily in the fasting state rather than the fed state. And MTR is the methionine synthase. It's the gene for the methionine synthase enzyme, which is the enzyme that takes the methyl group from folate, passes it to B12, and then passes it to homocysteine. NTRR is a backup repair enzyme that repairs vitamin B12 once it's been oxidized. NTRR is not it's not a normal part of the methylation cycle. It is a backup enzyme. It's kind of like a janitor, only instead of coming in to mop the floors every day, it's like a cleanup crew that's on call. So most of the time you're not using MTRR to your maximal, to even a tiny fraction of your maximal capacity, just because you don't have a lot of damage to the B12 molecule. About once every 200 or 300 cycles of the methylation cycle, B12 will get damaged. This is an average, but once every 200 or 300 cycles on average, B12 gets damaged, NTRR steps in and repairs it. So anyone who's, the reason that Miles is asking this is because I haven't really addressed them very much in most of what I've written on methylation. And there's a reason for that, which is that I'll address them in order. So methionine synthase, there's a bunch of polymorphisms in it. But the last time I did some research into this, I couldn't find very clear evidence on mechanistically what those polymorphisms were doing to it. And if I don't know what the polymorphism mechanistically is doing to the enzyme, then it's hard to build a nutritional program around it. And so I came to the conclusion that the MTR is, you can say some maybe things about it. So if that enzyme, I don't know if the polymorphism lowers the activity. If it does, then what that means is that no matter how much methylfolate you have or how much methyl B12 you have, you're not going to be very good at remethylating homocysteine. So it probably doesn't make any sense to inject methylcobalamin in that case. It probably makes zero sense because you can't use that enzyme. Now, maybe it's theoretically possible that it's theoretically possible that the polymorphism causes a defect in the methylfolate passing the methyl group to B12 and causes no defect in B12 passing the methyl group to homocysteine, in which case maybe injecting methylcobalamin or oral methylcobalamin at high doses maybe would do something there. But I think that's an extraordinary level of speculation. And I think it's rather bizarre to be injecting people with stuff on the basis of that level of speculation. Now, my suspicion would be that if in fact that enzyme doesn't work very well, what you actually would benefit from would be, number one, doubling up on the choline, just as you would actually, most of my MTHFR recommendations would make sense here. Choline would make sense because if you can't use the folate B12 pathway, you're going to rely more on the choline pathway to remethylate homocysteine. So if in fact that enzyme does anything, it probably doubles the choline that polymorphism does anything. It probably doubles the choline requirement like the MTHFR polymorphisms do. It also might make sense. I was going to say it might make sense to use SAMe, but I take that back. I don't know if it would. But the other thing in the methylation protocol that would make sense there is creatine, because creatine would lower your methylation demand. However, I don't think it would be as important to put creatine in there because in this case, you don't have a problem making methylfolate if everything else is working fine. And you theoretically should be fine at using choline for supporting methylation. The reason that I have the creatine in the MTHFR protocol is because I'm trying to spare methylfolate as much as possible, because methylfolate is the off switch for the glycine buffer system. And I want to reduce methylation demand so that the system is not incentivized to use up the methylfolate that you put into it. Because when it does, you're not very good at regenerating the methylfolate, and the low methylfolate levels will cause you to lose glycine. And that's why glycine is in the protocol. If your MTHFR is working fine, then the creatine is much less relevant, and the glycine really isn't that relevant. Glycine is still important for everyone, but it's not specifically relevant because of the genetic variations. With that said, I do think that because some tissues rely more on folate and B12 than they do on choline, that there might be some tissues that would benefit from supplementing creatine, so you could play around with it. I supplement creatine and I don't have any of these problems. So, I mean, there's no harm in trying out the creatine. Now, moving on to MTRR. My MTRR looks like a nightmare. So I'm homozygous for one of the polymorphisms that reduces the activity 3 to 4-fold. And I am heterozygous for another polymorphism that also reduces the activity 3 to 4-fold. So I don't know exactly what that adds up to, but my MTRR might be 5 to 6 to 7 times lower function than normal. Does that matter? Well, the way it would matter if it did matter would be that when I am exposed to oxidative stress, my B12 would get damaged at a higher rate than normal. And the reason, and that when it does get damaged, my MTRR would not be up to the task of fixing it. The reason the MTRR polymorphisms that lower the activity 3 to 4-fold are so common is because it's because either they're advantageous or they don't matter that much. And I believe the reason is that they don't matter that much. They do matter when you are exposed to higher than average oxidative stress. So in my view, there's no blanket recommendation for someone with MTRR polymorphisms. What I say is, because you are, in theory, you will be bad at repairing B12 when your B12 gets very damaged. You should thoroughly look at your B12 status at least once. And then every time you enter a new health era, you should monitor your B12 status again. What I mean by health era is your health changes or your developmental stage changes in a way that could impact your health. So changing health eras, and I'm making this term up, this is not a medical term, but changing health eras means you get sick with a sickness you never had before, that's a change in your health era. Or you go through puberty, that's a change in your health era. You go through menopause, that's a change in your health era. Or you go on birth control, that's a change in your health era. You know, any time where you say, I have good reason to think things might be different for me now than they were before, measure your B12 status again. And when I say thoroughly look at your B12 status, I mean, look at your serum B12, look at your homocysteine, and look at your urine or blood, preferably both methylmalonic acid, AKA MMA, not mixed martial arts. And look, my MTRR, as I said before, looks terrible on paper. But when I was at the peak of my mold and barium crisis, and when I went on an antifungal drug that interferes with the methylation system in the fungus, where there's a case report of someone with, I think it's MTHFR, getting neurological problems from using it. And I thought I was getting neurological problems from being on the antifungal. I measured everything I could think of about my B12 status, and everything looked fine. I'm not talking about just serum B12. I'm talking about all the functional markers too, looked just fine. So I mean, that just reinforced my belief that, that and the observational data that these things are so common. You know, if these things dramatically impacted your B12 status in a very negative way most of the time, not many people would have the polymorphisms, and yet they're very common. And those are huge reductions in activity. They're very, very common. So I think it's ridiculous to make a generalized nutritional protocol around either of those. MTR, it gives you a couple ideas you can experiment with. MTRR, be proactive about monitoring your B12 status. All right, thank you for your question, Miles. CJ says, CJ has many thank yous. I want to thank you several more times for your podcast on taking glycine for sleep before bed. My daughter and I now take it. I haven't slept that well for years. Same with my daughter. Won't take a supplement, but swears by glycine. Thank you. You're welcome, CJ. Thank you for your appreciation. CJ also, since that wasn't a question, I'll go for a second one for CJ. CJ also adds, do you know anything about the value of lithium for ADHD? I genuinely don't know anything positive, negative, or neutral about the value of lithium for ADHD. I'm sorry. Todd Becker says, some of the info in the vitamin classes is really surprising. So I'll say here, Todd is referring to the fact that I just released a Vitamins and Minerals 101 free class that anyone can take. And you can find it, I'll put a link in the show notes, but you can find it at chrismasterjohnphd.com/101. And this is a free class that is very elementary in so, if you think about the stuff that we've been talking about here, it's about 10 times more basic and elementary than that. I'm trying to make it so that it is accessible to people with, and really aimed at people without a background in nutrition, but so that it is still valuable for people who do have a background in nutrition. Taub has a background in nutrition, and she is saying as follows. Some of the info in the vitamin classes is really surprising and excellent info. Is it okay to share small sections of the vitamin info from your emails with my friends on Facebook with your name? The thiamine info was just released, confirmed my suspicions that keto diets can be very bad for thiamine levels. Taub, what I would prefer that you do is go to my Facebook, take the Facebook post for how people can sign up, share that post on your Facebook, and then take the quote from the lesson and put it in your blurb. So when you share something on Facebook, Facebook gives you the opportunity to say something about it. Like if you're on your phone, you'll say share, and it'll say share immediately or write post. You click write post, and it gives you opportunity to say something about it, and it might give you the opportunity to include or not include the original post. So include the original post. That way the link to sign up is there. The original post of what I wrote about it is there, but what people are reading first is what you're saying about it on top. So take the quote, write your own post about it, and then just say, hey, if you want to sign up for this class, you can sign up free below. That's what I would prefer you do. Thanks, Todd. And Leanne says, yes, the vitamin class is great. Thank you for all the awesome resources. Leanne, you're welcome. And Todd, thank you for asking me that about the best way to share that. Okay, Anonymous says, you recommend high glycemic carbs to help tryptophan get into the brain. What is the maximum level? What is the maximum level that your blood glucose can spike to after a meal without causing any damage? Some say 140 is the limit. Is there any evidence to support this? Anonymous, what the evidence is that people who in a controlled test have their blood glucose spike over 140 are at a higher risk of developing diabetes. So that's really what the evidence is. Now, does it cause damage? It's tough to say. So, I will say, I'll come out and say it. I don't believe that hyperglycemia is harmful because it is hyperglycemia. And I will clarify that there are levels of hyperglycemia that can kill you. That's definitely true. But what I mean is that outside the context of someone with diabetic ketoacidosis or hyperglycemia that is causing osmotic stress to the level that can kill the person, that winds them up in the emergency room. Even in diabetes, I think that it's not really about the glucose. So in these cases, let's start with diabetes as the model where we really have the evidence of what is causing harm. The harm of actually damaging your tissues and actually producing the cardiovascular and retinal, eye, and other neurological manifestation complications of diabetes, that's caused primarily by advanced glycation end products. And advanced glycation end products are partly caused by glucose reacting with proteins, but they are mainly caused by methylglyoxal reacting with proteins. And the reason that methylglyoxal, which I did my doctoral dissertation on, the reason that methylglyoxal, which is quantitatively the most important former of advanced glycation end products in diabetics, the reason that it is elevated is not because of hyperglycemia. It's because of deficient insulin signaling. And that is for two reasons. One is that you can derive methylglyoxal from glycolysis. You can derive methylglyoxal from ketogenesis. You can derive methylglyoxal from protein, specifically from the amino acid threonine. And insulin prevents you from making methylglyoxal in the glycolytic pathway no matter how high the glucose level is. Insulin, what it does in glycolysis is at the step where the intermediates spill out to generate methylglyoxal, insulin stimulates that enzyme that sucks the intermediates down. So in diabetes, you have lower expression of that enzyme and you have greater spillover out of glycolysis into forming methylglyoxal. And I'm not saying that the glucose itself doesn't, you do have high, in untreated diabetes, you could have blood glucose that goes up 5 times normal. And so that will be a factor that is influencing you to make not just 5, but maybe 10 or far more times methylglyoxal out of glycolysis. But the reason the glucose is elevated is because of deficient insulin signaling. And no matter how much glucose you have or don't have, insulin, once the glucose gets into the glycolytic pathway, insulin is protecting against methylglyoxal by clearing the glucose down. So it's the high glucose is an influence, but it's a minor influence compared to the effect of insulin. Besides this, insulin stops ketogenesis and suppresses the generation of methylglyoxal from ketogenesis. Insulin also stops the generation of methylglyoxal from threonine, which is an amino acid found in protein. Insulin also makes you make more glutathione, and glutathione is what detoxifies methylglyoxal. Insulin also stimulates the proteins, stimulates the enzymes that use glutathione to clear out methylglyoxal. So insulin is way more important to the formation of advanced glycation end products than glucose is. Specifically, the problem is not too much insulin. The problem is not enough insulin signaling. Even in type 2 diabetes, where insulin levels are high, you don't have enough insulin to normalize the protective pathways because you're resistant to that function of insulin. And a great example, totally irrelevant to how you would treat diabetes, but a great mechanistic demonstration of this is a study where so first of all, type 2 diabetics have bad glutathione status. If you put them in a normoglycemic hyperinsulinemic clamp, which is a situation where you pump them full of glucose and you pump them full of insulin, and you try to pump them in with as much insulin as you want, but you pump them with enough glucose to prevent that insulin from dropping their blood sugar. So it's a way to mechanistically intervene by raising insulin levels and keeping glucose levels normal. In type 2 diabetics who have high insulin levels already, as long as you keep their blood sugar normal, raising their insulin levels even further will take their bad glutathione status and make it the glutathione status of a normal, healthy person. So I'm not saying that the way to treat diet, like real world practical implications, nothing. In other words, I'm not saying that the treatment for diabetes is to have people inject you continuously with glucose and insulin. What I am saying is that this is proof of principle that the problem in diabetes is low, especially with respect to advanced glycation end products, is low insulin signaling. It isn't high glucose. High glucose plays a role, but a very minor role compared to low insulin signaling. And so this is true. The role of methylglyoxal starts at the first instance of hyperglycemia to cause the development from an acute first ever instance of hyperglycemia through the pathway of developing diabetes. And then in diabetes, methylglyoxal is overwhelmingly responsible for causing the cardiovascular complications, the complications in the eyes, the neurological complications of diabetes, cataracts, all of these things. And so I think it's a huge mistake to think that the spike in glucose is the thing going on rather than the deficient insulin signal. With that said, at some point, your blood glucose spiking will spill glucose into what's called the polyol pathway. And the polyol pathway is a way of metabolizing glucose that you can't put into normal pathways. And when that happens, you start sucking up NADPH. And NADPH happens to be very important for glutathione recycling. Glutathione recycling is very important for getting rid of methylglyoxal. So here is a way that a normal spike in blood glucose, maybe to 140, depending on your metabolism, could generate, could sap your glutathione status and contribute to advanced glycation end products. So there's a way to test for that. There is a test called 1,5-anhydroglucatol, I think is what it's called. Let me look that up to make sure. 1,5-anhydro. This test is called glycomark. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but it's 1,5-anhydroglucatol. This is a marker of whether your glucose spikes are on average generating consumption of glucose in the polyol pathway. And I think the best thing to do is to individualize the question of what's too high of a glucose spike. Too high of a glucose spike is whatever gives you a bad mark on the glycomark test. And that I think is the real true answer to your question. Now, if you want a rule of thumb, if you want to use a rule of thumb that is not individually tailorized to you, then the answer that is not a long rant is, use the 140 limit. But, you follow that up with, is there evidence to support this? No, I think the evidence says that this is a mediocre approximation of how to identify whether there's a problem. But a good way to try to identify whether you're having a problem with glucose spikes is the glycomark test. All right, thanks, Anonymous, for your question. Mindy says, I'm interested in your thoughts on nutrition and breast health. I monitor my D levels with targets in the mid-30s. What about iodine? Some in the alternative community recommend high doses of iodine, but I'm leery. I do have a family history, but not strong, of postmenopausal breast cancer. Besides general good health practices, sleep, hygiene, nutrition, regular exercise, healthy BMI, no drinking, what else can lower risk? And then there were a series of responses to this, where CJ says, I share your concerns. You might supplement with cruciferous supplements or add to diet. My vitamin D levels are always kept above 50, where cancer prevention and benefit begins. Green tea each day, keep and protect a healthy circadian rhythm. Mindy responds, I use DIM when I have symptoms of estrogen dominance. I eat lots of cruciferous vegetables. Last time I looked at the research, there wasn't benefit for breast cancer if your D levels above 35. Do you have data for the 50 level? And then she adds, I use D-calcium glucarate when I have symptoms of estrogen dominance, but don't always have that. I wonder if I should take it all the time. Maybe I will take the question or comment. Mindy, this would be a good question to redirect to Carrie Jones when I have her on. I'm going to do a Ask Us Anything about hormones and have her on as a guest that's at some point soon. We haven't finalized the date yet, but she's the medical director for the Dutch test. And she knows more than I do about DIM and calcium D-glucarate and all this stuff. But yeah, I mean, I have not seen, I don't think, any instance of a general population level benefit of getting vitamin D levels above the levels that suppress parathyroid hormone, which on average in most cases is around 30 to 35 nanograms per milliliter. I do think at the level of individual people, there are many people who would benefit by having higher levels, but I suspect that in almost every case or every case, you would find that in those individuals, it takes that much vitamin D to maximally suppress their parathyroid hormone. So I'm a big fan of measuring your own parathyroid hormone to individualize your vitamin D dose. And when you measure parathyroid hormone, you want to, ideally you measure it at the same time as 25-OHD and 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D, also known as calcitriol. Measure that triplet together so that you know, for example, if your parathyroid hormone is X, you know that a 25-OHD of Y is what correlates with a PTH of X. You want to know that for yourself. But what you want to see is, as a baseline, my assumption is PTH is probably maximally suppressed at 30 picograms per milliliter, which is halfway up the reference range. It might be further suppressed down to 20 in some people. So the baseline rule of thumb to see are you probably getting it maximally suppressed is how close are you to 30 or below. But the true test is if you increase your D a little higher, or you increase your calcium intake a little higher, does your PTH go down further? And if it does, then you probably, as an individual, need that amount of vitamin D or calcium. And the role of calcitriol is basically the higher within the normal range. As you go from the middle of the range to the upper end of the range, the higher the calcitriol is, the more likely that your most important weakness is that to include calcium. And the lower it is, closer to the middle of the range, the more probability it is that you would get benefit out of increasing vitamin D. So with that said, iodine, I don't know whether to be bullish or bearish around iodine. There's a lot of anecdotal support of high-dose iodine for breast tenderness and fibrocystic breast disease. There's not a lot of science on that, including both the effectiveness and the safety. So part of me says that, so I would not use high-dose iodine as a preventative against breast cancer because you have no metric on which to judge the efficacy of the iodine, and I don't think there's enough science to justify that. But if you have symptoms of breast tenderness, if you have fibrocystic breast disease, then I think you have a measurable outcome that you can test in yourself whether the high-dose iodine is having an effect. And there are things that you can do to monitor the safety of it. And so I think if you can monitor the safety and you can monitor the effect, then you can try it. But if it's a totally hypothetical, I have breast cancer in my family and maybe this will save me, then no. If you do high-dose iodine and you want to measure the safety of it, then I think you should get a full panel thyroid test at baseline and make sure that the iodine doesn't mess up any of the markers on the thyroid test. That would be my overwhelming safety concern. And that's because although I think there is controversy over this, and the controversy is well-deserved, the main concern about high-dose iodine causing a problem is by negatively affecting the thyroid gland. So other things to do, it would probably be good to get a Dutch complete panel if you can afford it, and look at your estrogen metabolites, because some of the estrogen metabolites are more carcinogenic than others. And boosting methylation is, in general, a good idea when it comes to controlling the carcinogenic, anti-carcinogenic balance of estrogen metabolites. But the Dutch test actually has a methylation index that is taken not out of general methylation, but out of actual methylated estrogen metabolites. And so I think that would be worthwhile from a prevention standpoint. On the estrogen dominance standpoint, I will suggest that you listen to Peter Attia's recent podcast on the uses of hormone replacement therapy, where they really bring into controversy the whole idea that estrogen is causal in breast cancer. I'm making a note for myself to put this in the show notes. They really call into question whether hormone replacement therapy in the form of Premarin is actually a negative with respect to cancer. I highly recommend listening to that, because if Premarin doesn't cause breast cancer, and this is the horse-derived estrogen, if Premarin doesn't cause breast cancer, then estrogen dominance probably doesn't cause breast cancer. And actually, I think when I have Carrie on, I want to pre-discuss with her some papers that I think are very interesting in really overturning some of my ideas about estrogen dominance. For example, in PMS, women with water retention in PMS have normal estrogen around their period and higher progesterone. And I looked at these papers and I'm like, what? That contradicts everything I've ever read. And I think in the alternative health community, there's a lot of, I think estrogen gets a worse rap than it should have. But yeah, that's all I have to say for now. So I know it's not a complete answer. I hope to have some more information when Carrie comes on, but I hope that provided at least a little bit of value to you, Mindy. Anita Morgan says, is urine pH a good way to test the body's pH level? What minerals will raise an acid pH? There's a lot of, it's hard to say something about this without getting trolls coming in and saying that that urine pH doesn't reflect body pH, but a lot of people throw the baby out with the bathwater. So look, your urine pH is not going to be the pH of your blood. It's not going to be the pH of your brain. It's not going to be the pH of anything else except the urine. So the urine is not telling you the pH of your other tissues. However, the urine pH is telling you the acid burden that your body has been subjected to. And it's telling you, you can make an inference about the compensations that your body has had to engage in. And you can also make an inference about the limitations of your body in compensating for that, because even your urine pH should be buffered. It's not the case that you put a little bit of acid in the urine and then boom, your pH is going to go down. It's the case that your body has a whole bunch of systems to buffer even the urine pH as you excrete acids from your body. So the system is like in your blood, the tiniest change in your pH is immediately going to set in motion a change in your breathing rate. that is going to cause you to either increase or decrease the exhalation of carbon dioxide in order to adjust the pH of the blood. And then there's going to be a longer term compensation where you're going to take some of those acids and pee them out. And when you pee them out, your kidney is going to buffer those acids in the way of preserving the urine pH. So if your urine pH goes down from 6.5 to 5.5, it tells you that your urine pH is like 10 times more acidic, but it doesn't tell you that your blood is 10 times more acidic. And so the critics of using urine pH will point that out. But what it does tell you is that your body has been subjected to a rather enormous acid burden, number one. And number two, that you're even starting to overwhelm your kidney's ability to buffer the urine and prevent the pH of the urine from changing. So it does tell you about the stress put on the system. And so I should link to in the show notes to my story about how if you Google Masterjohn urine pH, this will come up. My story about how I used my urine pH as a way to be able to start working out again. And in my case, this was because this was during the height of my barium mold crisis. And what was happening was I would work out and then I'd be flattened out for hours and I'd just lay in bed. And then I wouldn't be able to work. I wouldn't have the energy to work out again for like 5 days. And it turned out that this was because my workouts were causing too much acid load. The acid load was making me fatigued and it was causing my urine pH to drop ridiculously low. And I used my urine pH to gauge how much bicarbonate and how frequently to take the bicarbonate to normalize my urine pH. Not so much to normalize the urine, but to normalize the stress on my body. So I'm producing lactic acid during a workout. That lactic acid, eventually winds up in my pee, but in the moment, it's fatiguing my muscles, So, and I used it as a very good metric. My energy dramatically improved with repeated the first time I did it. I took bicarbonate, went peed, measured my urine pH, laid back down. Did that cycle like 7 times. And the moment that I felt energetic was the moment that my urine pH upon the next measurement got back up into the 6s. So I think it's very useful as a marker of the stress on the system. Now, the real goal, the short-term goal is to resolve any symptoms that could be driven by acid load, such as fatigue, by replacing bicarbonate. I don't think you want to do that long term because I think you could hurt your digestion and I think that you could maybe predispose to certain infections in certain tissues by long-term constant dosing of bicarbonate, at least in theory. And so I think what you want to do is use it when you need to, but then try to find what is the hole in the system that's causing the urine pH to go up. A high potassium intake would be the number one thing that would acutely affect it, apart from taking the bicarbonate. And by the way, always take the bicarbonate on an empty stomach away from food. And in my case, fixing a zinc deficiency was what allowed me to stop taking the bicarbonate. And at that time, I could have theorized that zinc would be involved because zinc is a cofactor for carbonic anhydrase, which is involved in regulating your pH level. But I didn't, it wasn't obvious to me. I mean, when I had done my zinc resources, I've never included exercise-induced acidosis as a symptom of zinc deficiency because it's just not one of the things that stand out as a zinc deficiency issue, and yet it was for me. I had other reasons to suspect a zinc deficiency that were totally unrelated from that. And what I noticed by accident was that fixing the zinc deficiency fixed that problem. So there are probably other nutrients that I'm not thinking about at all that might be relevant that you would have to identify on the basis of other signs and symptoms or other testing that may play a role in regulating acid-base balance. And if you find that, let me know because I'd like to know what the other things are that impact it. Thank you for your question, Anita. Mindy has a follow-up. Can you define a high dose for iodine? I don't, Mindy, that was meant as a follow-up for the breast discussion. Mindy, I don't know if I adequately define that in that context. So I would say anything over 200 micrograms of iodine is a modestly high dose of iodine. Anything over a milligram is where I would start to want to be working with testing to make sure that there's no harm. But what people are out there using that I would define as a megadose of iodine is 50 milligrams. Probably 15 milligrams per day is the limit of what you might say would be traditional to consume. And so I think that's a relevant, a relevant framework. 200 micrograms normal, above 200 micrograms, flirting with high, above a milligram, pretty high. Somewhere between a milligram and 50, you move from high to megadosing. I hope that helped. Mindy, I see in the chat you asked about glycine as a follow-up to another question. Just as a reminder, people, please don't put the follow-ups to the chat unless people are raising their hand and coming on screen. Otherwise, I probably won't see it. So how much glycine in the morning? You just have to, this is a follow-up from the ADHD discussion. You just have to follow up. You just have to test that against what works. And as a starting point in adults, 3 to 5 grams of glycine is what gets used on a per meal basis. And so I would start in the lower end because you're working with a kid, but I think those are reasonable doses to try, 3 to 6 grams. I wouldn't go above, if you go to 6 grams a meal and you're getting no effect or you're getting harm, then I would stop at that point. Because if you're not experiencing anything beneficial, you're probably not going to. But yeah. Tom says, please make a short video on what you just talked about with methyl glyoxide, frequent episodes of hypoglycemia, and now wonder about insulin signaling and how to improve it. We'd love to hear more about how to improve this if you have suggestions for this. Sure, I've done some work on methyl glyoxal. I'll put a reminder to myself to put into the show notes methyl glyoxal. And while I'm at it, I should probably put my dissertation up on ResearchGate, because I have what I think is probably one of the best reviews of methyl glyoxal in existence, in my opinion. Not saying I relied on great reviews of methyl glyoxal while I was working, but it's a shame that it's not available free. Well, everything's available for free with Sci-Hub, but yeah, I should put it up on ResearchGate and link to it so that the introduction of that can be used as a review for other people to access. Thanks, Todd. Leanne White says, is supplementing with cyanocobalamin IM, I assume IM is intramuscular, is supplementing with cyanocobalamin intramuscularly dangerous if you have MTHFR? I've tried using methylcobalamin SL, which I'm guessing is sublingual, at high doses, but couldn't get my levels up. Thoughts? Yeah, so cyanocobalamin is cheap and there's not really any clear evidence that it's harmful, but I just don't like the idea that it is cobalamin bound to cyanide. It's not found in the food supply, and forming cyanocobalamin and peeing it out is actually one of the main ways you detoxify cyanide. So even though it's very clear that cyanocobalamin can fix a dietary B12 deficiency, I have not found head-to-head studies comparing the different forms. I just can't get it. I can't wrap my mind around how the end product of cyanide detoxification that you pee out in the urine could possibly have as good a utilization rate as something that you are not trying to pee out in the urine. Like I don't see how it's possible that the urinary loss of cyanocobalamin could not be higher than the other forms of cobalamin. So look, hydroxycobalamin is also relatively inexpensive. It's relatively easy to get as injections. And it is not an end product of detoxification. And it is found in very high concentrations in the food supply. The normal forms of vitamin B12 that you find in the diet from food are hydroxycobalamin and methylcobalamin in milk, and hydroxycobalamin and adenosylcobalamin in meat. So hydroxycobalamin is the most universal food form of cobalamin, and it is always a substantial part of the food supply. And it's cheaper, I'm pretty sure it's cheaper than methylcobalamin. So I would use intramuscular injections of hydroxycobalamin. And I don't know what your situation is, but I'm guessing that you have pernicious anemia or something that's making it harder to absorb it orally. I will say that I have no idea if sublingual B12 is absorbed. I mean, I'll look into it when I do the Mastering Nutrition episode on B12 upcoming in a month or two. I'll do a thorough review of that. But most B vitamins start their absorption in the stomach and then mostly absorb in the small intestine. In the case of B12, when you're dealing with food, you're absorbing it in the small intestine almost exclusively with intrinsic factor that's produced in your stomach. And in pernicious anemia, you have an autoimmune attack on the cells that make intrinsic factor. In gastritis, even subclinical gastritis, you have general inflammation in the stomach that hurts the production of intrinsic factor. So as long as you don't have, as long as you don't have corresponding small intestinal inflammation, then you should have normal expression of B12 transporters in the intestine. And actually, I take that back. The B12 transporters in the intestine are irrelevant if you don't have the intrinsic factor. So what's relevant is that even if the B12 transporters in the intestine don't work at all, you absorb about 1% of an oral dose of B12 in the small intestine. And so you're only going to get benefit out of megadosing the B12. There are almost no safety concerns about megadosing B12. There are fewer safety concerns about megadosing hydroxycobalamin than about megadosing methylcobalamin. So that's food for thought. Again, justifying the hydroxycobalamin. And I mean, you're talking, 1% of the dose. So, but you never know if you also have small intestinal inflammation that's reducing that further. And there's not really any harm in taking big doses. So I don't know, I'd start with a milligram of oral hydroxycobalamin, test that against your serum B12. If it's not moving your serum B12, see if 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 milligrams do, because if they do, then taking that every day is going to be probably easier than, well, I mean, it depends on what you like, but you're probably going to like taking oral B12 more than you're going to like getting intramuscular injections. So I would see if raising the dose works first. I'd use oral hydroxycobalamin, and then if you have to use intramuscular, I would use hydroxycobalamin. Leanne follows up, yes, the cyanide factor freaks me out too. Thanks for your suggestion. I've struggled with gastritis. Thanks for the extra research. Yeah, if you have gastritis, then you definitely have B12 deficiency if it's an ongoing thing, because so half the population has H. pylori. This is a principal cause of B12 deficiency among omnivores. So, the main cause of B12 deficiency in vegans and vegetarians is being vegans and vegetarians. And the rates of B12 deficiency among vegans and vegetarians is like 70% of vegetarians and over 90% of vegans when you use high quality, rigorous functional markers of B12 deficiency. If you look for symptoms, it's way less than that, right? But the early biochemical evidence of B12 deficiency, 70% of vegetarians, over 90% of vegans. And then in omnivores, you have like 15 or 16% of the population who are B12 deficient. Most of them are elderly. And about 0.1% of the population and 1% of the people over 65 have pernicious anemia. So that's one important cause. But among omnivores, the main cause is gastritis. And this right here, what I'm about to say, is the main cause. Half of us are infected with H. pylori. Starting in childhood, the H. pylori causes subclinical gastritis. Every year of our life, it gets worse and it gets worse and it gets worse and it gets worse. But we're talking about such low levels of inflammation that you could make it to 65 and you still wouldn't have gastritis symptoms. Some of you would, some of us would, but most of the people who have the gastritis would not have symptoms even at this old age. And yet, by the time you're 65, about probably like 30% of the people who have H. pylori and 15% of the general population have subclinical gastritis bad enough to cause B12 deficiency. So if you know you have gastritis, then your gastritis is a lot worse than the gastritis that causes B12 deficiency. And so that's the big thing. But even with gastritis, very high megadoses of oral B12 should cause enough passive transport in the intestine to be absorbed at a meaningful level. And I guess you just have to judge it against, like, from a medical perspective, they're always worried about compliance because the general, unlike the people who are showing up to this AMA, the general population has very low motivation compared to us. And so injection is preferable from that standpoint because there's fewer things to do, right? So plus you have an accountability buddy because someone's got to inject you. So you get an accountability buddy to do something once a month versus you have the personal responsibility to do something every day. From a compliance perspective, it's vastly superior to getting injected. But if you're already taking 15 supplements every morning, then it's probably way easier for you to just add megadose of B12 in with those oral supplements than to get intramuscular injection. I'd prefer it. So thank you for your question, Leon. All right, we're wrapping up. We got 15 minutes left. I will go over to answer all the questions, but please don't ask any more questions. I'll just answer the ones that we have, and then we'll conclude. Anonymous says, what is the place of bilirubin and uric acid in the antioxidant system? And what can the results of these measures on a blood test tell us about the level of oxidative stress in the body? I guess this depends a little bit on your semantics of what you mean by role in the antioxidant system and your view of how that system functions. But in my view, they don't have a role in the antioxidant system, but they do act as antioxidants in the blood. And so I think intracellularly, where most of antioxidant support is highly relevant, then they're not that big a deal. In the blood, in the plasma, they can be a big deal. It's quite possible that uric acid is one of the most important antioxidants in plasma. But I would say it's highly debatable whether we put uric acid into the blood as specifically to achieve that versus that happens to be an accidental, sort of just incidental to making uric acid during the excretion of purines, which make up the building blocks of DNA and ATP and things like that. So I would not use them. I wouldn't use them as either way. It doesn't matter. Let's say you deliberately put bilirubin into plasma for an antioxidant. You put uric acid into plasma for an antioxidant. who cares from the perspective of your question? That still doesn't tell you anything about the antioxidant status of the body, because there are other reasons that you put bilirubin into the plasma, right? So like, if your bilirubin is elevated, it doesn't necessarily mean you have awesome antioxidant status. It could mean you have, geez, I'm going to mispronounce that French. I don't know, the syndrome with high bilirubin. I forget the French pronunciation of it. Anyway, Guillain-Barre, whatever. Sorry. You could have that, or you could have liver damage. Like you could have jaundice. Like those are some reasons for bilirubin to elevate. And so I'm not going to use it as a marker of how good your antioxidant status is. And then uric acid, your uric acid could be low because you're deficient in molybdenum, or your uric acid could be high because you have gout. So I don't think no matter what their role as an antioxidant is, I don't think they're good. They're not specific markers. I think the best marker of oxidative stress in plasma is the cysteine to cystine ratio. Cysteine is the reduced form of the amino acid cysteine. Cystine is the oxidized form. And there are good studies at a general population level showing that is the major specific indicator of oxidative stress that takes place in the plasma. The glutathione couple, glutathione reduced versus oxidized, is probably the best marker in the blood of what's happening with oxidative stress intracellularly. Unfortunately, the only test that looks at this is HDRI. And I feel very, very torn about whether we should be working with HDRI because I know a lot about measuring glutathione. And I've had some clients who got their glutathione test. And what you need to do to accurately measure glutathione to preserve the sample is according to my client who did the test, is not at all part of the instructions or process that they use. So I'm very skeptical of using them. And no one else offers the reduced to oxidized version of glutathione. So what I would recommend to assess oxidative stress would be Genova's Oxidative Stress 2.0 panel. It does give you the cysteine to sulfate, the cysteine to cystine ratio. And I'll put a note to put a link to that in the show notes. I think that's the best marker. And they do have glutathione on there, and they do have a bunch of other things that can be useful in assessing oxidative stress. So I would use that. Thank you, Anonymous, for your question. Chris Morrell says, Chris, in the absence of any other notable abnormalities in a metabolic panel with a high BUN, blood urea and nitrogen, that's slightly out of range, I'm going to stop you here. I'm going to say you're eating about 1 gram of protein per kilogram body weight or somewhere around there. Now I'll read on the rest of your question and see if I'm right. Would this usually indicate low stomach acid? I work with a function. That's a fascinating idea that is very puzzling to me. I doubt it, but I'll keep reading on. I worked with a functional practitioner for anxiety and lifelong seasonal and food allergies a couple of years ago who did a similar panel, same high BUN, and her main approach was treating low stomach acid with HCl and including supplements for B1, B2, B6, B12. Her general idea was my body is starving itself because of my inability to retain nutrients with low HCl. More context. I'm considering a Heidelberg stomach acid test here in LA for about $375 to foolproof this. Perhaps the result of being both vegetarian and vegan for much of my 20s could have contributed to a decline in stomach acid. I'm thin, but also moderately muscular, 6 feet, 150 pounds, I'm guessing that is. And it's always been very difficult to gain weight. I get the Heidelberg test. That's the only accurate way to assess stomach acid. If you want to do something else, it would be better to use the kitchen techniques, like take a teaspoon of half a teaspoon of baking soda and see how long you take to burp, or take HCl with your meal and keep adding capsules and see what, how many capsules you can take without reflux. That's probably both more accurate than using bun. Chris clarifies he probably eats 90 to 100 grams of protein a day. So first of all, in my experience, everyone who is physically active and eats a decent amount of protein has a bun that's toward the top of the range or slightly above it. So there's that. Remember, the bun range is the mean. I'm pretty sure this is true. It's the mean plus minus 2 standard deviations. And so if you're an athlete and you're eating a lot of protein, even if you're not eating a tremendous amount of protein, but you're very active, right? And so what do you do when you're very active? You burn through more protein. And what do you do when you burn through protein? You make urea. I find it almost certainly the case that a slightly high bun would never be a useful marker of low stomach acid and would never be a good marker of poor protein digestion. If you want to know if you have poor protein digestion, measure the protein in your stool. Like, get a GI stool test that looks at what you're not absorbing. That's how you test that. The reason that this sounds nuts to me is, maybe you are allowing the protein to ferment in your gut and generate urea from the microbes that you're absorbing. Like, maybe. But where does most of the urea come from that's in your blood? It comes from the urea cycle, which is how you get rid of ammonia. And how do you get ammonia? How do you get ammonia in your body? That goes into the urea cycle. You digest protein into amino acids, you absorb the amino acids, and then you break them down so that you can either burn them for energy or turn them into glucose or turn them into certain neurotransmitters or whatever. And then you lose ammonia that you put into the urea cycle. So why wouldn't the urea be a marker of having good digestion? If something could, I'm not even sure that we could say it could be an equally useful test of good digestion and bad digestion of protein. I don't know if it's as good a marker of bad digestion of protein as it is of good digestion of protein. But even if it were just as good a marker of bad digestion of protein as it is of good digestion of protein, something that's an equally good marker of two opposites is not a good marker of anything. Hope that helps answer your question, Chris. Okay, let me put in one note for myself. Okay, Tiana says, I've been using a ketogenic diet for the last month. I started to help improve blood glucose regulation, and I've seen improvement in that metric. My ketone levels have been hovering around 1 millimole per liter. I'm not necessarily concerned with getting them higher as I'm getting the results I wanted. I'm getting the results that I wanted from this dietary strategy, but I'm wondering about what factors would prevent them from being higher. I've been doing some light Olympic weightlifting technique work and light bodybuilding training 5-6 days a week, getting 8+ hours of sleep a night. Stress levels pretty low, and currently have a practitioner who is treating me for candida. That potentially impact ketone levels. You didn't say what your carb and protein levels are, but it's probably that your carb and protein levels are high enough to suppress ketones. So if you want to reply to your comment and put your put your carb and protein intake in, then I'll take a look at that. But that's my initial belief. Todd Becker says, some of the stuff in the cheat sheet is really great, especially stuff about saponification of minerals. I would love to share this with my oxalate friends. I keep telling Ben Lynch that folks with high fat in diet or poor fat breakdown, PEMT, are going to be a sitting duck for oxalate issues. The high fecal fat seems to be a big deal in that this fat is going to create soap with calcium and prevent calcium from binding with oxalate to assist in excretion. Do you agree? Tob, I do agree with your last statement. So let me go through one by one. First of all, saponification of minerals. The point here is that if you have malabsorption of fat, the fatty acids are going to bind to any positively charged minerals in your diet. And this has been particularly well studied in preterm infants, where if the poor digestion of fat, or poor absorption of fatty acids causes the fatty acids to bind to the calcium and have lower bioavailability. So if you surpass your ability to absorb the fat, the fatty acids can bind minerals and induce mineral deficiencies. I agree with this. I don't agree that PMT polymorphism is a marker of poor fat breakdown. PMT polymorphism is a marker of poor synthesis of phosphatidylcholine that will impair export of fat from the liver, but that I don't know. Maybe what you're saying is that poor phosphatidylcholine production in the liver would lead to poor bile acid emulsification in the gallbladder, which would lead to. Okay, yeah, I see your line of reasoning. Okay, I take back what I said. Okay, so yeah, low phosphatidylcholine synthesis due to the PEMT. I was thinking of it as a direct marker, and it's not a direct marker, but it could theoretically impact. And this is probably especially true if you have a low phosphatidylcholine intake. Probably eating phosphatidylcholine protects against this, but yeah, low phosphatidylcholine levels in the liver, partly as an interaction between low activity of the PEMT enzyme and low intake of phosphatidylcholine from food, could cause bile acid issues, which could in turn cause fat malabsorption. Okay, yes, I agree with that. Then the high, then I agree with everything you said. If you have fat malabsorption and you have enough digestion of the fat to release the free fatty acids from triglycerides, but you don't have enough absorption of those fatty acids will bind calcium. If the fatty, and they won't bind oxalate, they can't. And so binding the calcium will lower the calcium absorption, and it will also prevent the calcium from binding oxalate. Calcium binding oxalate is what prevents oxalate absorption. So yes, I would think that would increase oxalate absorption. Absolutely. Thank you, Todd, for your question. Anonymous says, what is the best targets for omega-3 index and AA-EPA ratio in the erythrocyte fatty acid test? I think I don't agree with using either of them. And if someone could email me a readout of what that test looks like when you get the omega quant, I'd like to see it because I haven't gotten it for myself. But my interest in using that test is to make sure that arachidonic acid and DHA are on the high end of normal. That's what I want to look for. I don't specifically want to look at the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. And the AA to EPA ratio, I do not believe in wanting to get it low enough to prevent inflammation. I don't believe in using it that way. But I do believe that if it were too low, it could cause problems. And I don't know what the cutoff would be. But if you're on the low end of normal, then I would think about cutting back your intake of EPA. But my main concern would be if you're in the low or even middle end of the normal range for either arachidonic acid or DHA, I think you want to increase your intake of those. Or look for, particularly if your intake is already high, look for the cause of low levels, especially if both of them are low, that could be caused by inflammation or oxidative stress. Anonymous says, waking up in the morning and can't stop sneezing for about an hour. Any thoughts on what's going on? Is this a histamine thing, and why does it happen first thing in the morning? Why does it happen first thing in the morning? I think that's normal if you do have sneezing issues for it to happen first thing in the morning. I have no idea why off the top of my head. I'm sure that someone knows this and I just don't. But if I want to throw out some total, complete wild guesses, I would say, first of all, lying down, you're going to have more postnasal drip in your throat. And that itself should cause throat problems more than sneezing. But you might have some things falling into your nose. You might have some stagnancy in having your nose lay backward versus having your nose be vertical, where the mucus, the gravity is helping drainage. That could be one thing. You could have dust mites or something in bed bugs in your bed. That could be one thing. You could be sleeping under something where the dust is spilling off the windowsill, or if you have fans or air conditioners, it could be blowing things into your nose. That could be a factor. And then there's probably some physiological hormonal thing that I can't think of off the top of my head. I mean, I want to think that there's something about not being quite revved up that is doing this, but like your cortisol should spike in the morning, which should have an anti-inflammatory effect. But maybe it's the cumulative effect of the cortisol being low while you sleep that leads to some of the inflammation. Someone's in the chat saying pollen count is usually highest in the morning from what I understand. Yeah, so maybe it's a factor of your environment. Hard to say, especially if you're indoors though. Those are my thoughts. Tiana adds a follow-up to previous 80 grams of protein, 50 grams of carbs. Lower the carbs if you want more ketones, but you said you're getting the results you want. So don't lower the carbs to try to raise the ketones. That's my instinct. Anonymous, unless, if you're not getting results, that's different, right? But think about, why did you say you want results? You want to help improve glucose regulation. You want to improve glucose regulation. There you go. Don't use ketones as your metric at all and rely exclusively on tests of your blood sugar. Anonymous says, my adult daughter has always had trouble storing ferritin. She becomes anemic easily. She is just double iron bisglycinate. She is using double iron bisglycinate for 6 weeks therapeutically, and ferritin only went to 20. And serum iron went out of range. She stopped and started this premenopausal multi, PE and CAPS 950. Why is this a lifelong problem? I always have low ferritin. I'm postmenopausal, usually around a 9. I heard 5 minerals are required to store ferritin. True. What can she do? We both have an underlying collagen disorder and proven partial absorption. While certainly not helping, I think it is not the sole reason for the difficulty. We can supplement like crazy, and it does not fix the issue. When stopped, it bottoms out. Also, does heme iron lift ferritin easily? Does heme iron lift ferritin more easily than what's in supplements? It doesn't require vitamin C, right? Okay. So basically, the executive summary of this question is low iron levels that won't improve. So let me just make sure it's not just the ferritin, it's serum iron, right? Serum iron went out of... Anonymous, can you clarify the transferrin saturation in the serum iron? When you see the serum iron went out of range, you're saying out of the top of the range? Okay, so if the problem is not getting iron up, then there's not enough information here for me to say for sure. So please don't, and as always, don't take this as medical advice, but this is just me brainstorming. based on how I know the physiology. But I think that would be consistent, possibly. If you're talking about the serum iron going out of the range high with an inability to get the ferritin up, one of the possibilities, CJ says, CJ, you want to come on, you want to talk? I just promoted you as a panelist. CJ, are you with us? Okay, looks like can't get CJ on. Okay, CJ, we can talk in the chat or as a reply to your question if you want. If we can't get your video or audio on. All right, here's my thoughts. So that could be a case of an early hemochromatosis setup. So I've talked about this in Q&As in the past, so I'll be brief about it. But in hemochromatosis, the defect is that your short-term iron storage rises and does not kick in the adaptations for long-term iron storage. And specifically, the ferritin won't increase. And you can be vulnerable to having too much iron while the ferritin doesn't increase. And in that case, you do not want to use the ferritin as the primary marker. It's quite possible that because you are both women, you've been protected by menstruation from the iron levels getting too high. And so all you see, even if you're postmenopausal, the protection that you did have during menopause has made it so you haven't been dealing with iron overload consequences for very long. And so you really need to look at the other markers because it makes a complete difference whether you're anemic. So if you have markers of iron deficiency anemia, then the interpretation is totally different. If you have no evidence of hemochromatosis anemia, if you don't have thyroid problems, if you have no apparent health problems that trace the iron deficiency, then you probably don't have iron deficiency. It's probably that the ferritin response is low. And what that probably means on a practical level is it makes you vulnerable to the negative effects of iron overload were you to experience it. And you probably don't want to be supplementing the iron. But if you have iron deficiency anemia, then all of a sudden the interpretation is totally different. You might have some defect in handling of the iron, and in that case, I would say copper and riboflavin would be the nutrients that I would look to first, although there could be many other nutrients involved. Everything hinges on whether there's any, you really have to look at the anemia markers to judge how likely an actual iron deficiency versus excess situation is. In the chat, oh boy, CJ lost the ability to respond in the chat when I promoted her panelist. So, sorry, I'm still getting used to the controls there. CJ, can you respond in the reply to your comment now? Anyway, I'll look for a reply from you, but the bulk of the answer is that it all hinges on the CBC and anemia markers to interpret whether there's an iron deficiency situation there at all. Anonymous says, cryptopyrrole urine testing, worthwhile ADHD addressing nutritionally. It's been recommended, but one of the symptoms is inability to tan. My daughter tans immediately and darkly and never burns like me. In the winter, we are fair, and in the summer, we get dark with sun exposure and never show a burn, although we can feel burned. Please comment. Cryptopyrroles is, I diagnosed myself with cryptopyrroluria back in the day. on some symptoms. And I tried to get a conventional doctor to order the test, and he was like, I was nuts, and diagnosed me with anxiety. Look, cryptopyrroluria was advanced as a disease many decades ago and was never given adequate attention in follow-up science. Great Plains uses a test for cryptopyrroles. You're kind of in a gray zone. Like, I'd be interested to see what the results of that test are. I'd be interested to see if treating it based on assuming the test is accurate does anything. I think it's fairly harmless to increase zinc and B6 as a test of whether that's true and see if you get results from it. But I wouldn't treat it like a diagnostic value, because no one has followed up any science on that disorder in the decades since it's been proposed. And cryptopyrroles are very similar to porphyrins that LabCorp has a whole series of tests on. And so I would go to LabCorp's site, go to test menu, and then search it for porphyrin, and you'll see a bunch of things that come up. And some of the concerns are relatively similar in terms of zinc and B6 that come up with those. But that's, in my view, the pyroluria thing is, to the extent it has merit, it's probably has some relation to the porphyrin disorders, and maybe is one. I'm not sure. But I would definitely, like, if you're going to investigate the issue, I would investigate it with those. And I can say that from the porphyrin disorders, some of them will cause various things to happen in the skin, ranging from the skin turning brown when exposed to sun, to pain in response to sun exposure, to the skin turning red in response to the sun, not a usual red, but a weird red. Some of them will cause red to brown discoloration of the urine, but some of them don't cause any colors. And because there's a whole category of porphyrin disorders that all in the same pathway, and some of them are sun sensitive, some aren't, some accumulate in the skin, some don't, some of them change color, some of them cause pain, some don't. You can't really go exclusively on those symptoms. Thank you for your question. Anonymous says, if you have MTHFR, is it dangerous to supplement with cyanocobalamin rather than methylcobalamin? I've tried using sublingual methyl B12 and couldn't make any progress with increasing my B12 levels. Thoughts? I will mostly reference what I said before about the injections. And but in this case, the specific question is on MTHFR. So I guess I'll address the unique aspects of that. So what I had said before is I don't like cyanocobalamin. I prefer hydroxycobalamin. Methylcobalamin is fine. Denatylcobalamin is fine. But hydroxycobalamin is the neutral form of vitamin B12. So if you're concerned about methylation-related issues, you would want to be careful with methylcobalamin supplementation in a way that you would not need to be careful about hydroxycobalamin supplementation. And so if you don't have a specific methylation-related goal, then I think hydroxycobalamin is the default, because that's the sort of like metabolically neutral B12, and that it's not predisposed to any particular system, and it's not going to affect any system in a specific way, apart from just being nutritional B12. Then the second thing is, if you had MTHFR, is it dangerous to supplement with cyanocobalamin? Doesn't matter. I don't think MTHFR has anything to do with methylcobalamin, really. Except there's one place where I think that it has an issue, and this is with, you know what, I want to take a minute to rant. There's a lot of, so I did a post on your MTHFR in quotes is just a riboflavin deficiency, and if you didn't see this, go check it out. It has like, I think like 3 point something thousand shares on Facebook so far. Gets a couple hundred, 100 or 200 comments a day, I think. So there's a lot of people out there who are saying, look, I take riboflavin and it doesn't change the fact that I feel like crap unless I take methylfolate. Or it doesn't change the fact that I need to be careful with methylated Bs. Or it doesn't change the fact that all these other things. And what I was saying in that post is that there's a compelling argument that the reason the C677T and probably by extension the A1298C polymorphisms lower the activity of MTHFR is because they decrease the binding affinity for riboflavin, and the MTHFR enzyme, if it's not bound to riboflavin, is defective. So if you have mediocre riboflavin concentrations and you have C677T homozygous MTHFR, you have low MTHFR activity because fewer of the MTHFR enzymes are bound to riboflavin. You can fix that by increasing riboflavin concentrations. And so you just supplement extra riboflavin and you can normalize MTHFR activity. And what I put MTHFR in quotes because I meant it the way that people mean when they say, I have MTHFR. Everyone has MTHFR. What people mean by that is they have these MTHFR polymorphisms. And what I meant by that title was what is that there's a very compelling, it's not totally airtight, it's not completely proven, but there's a very compelling argument that the low activity of the C677T polymorphism of MTHFR is exclusively a result of mediocre riboflavin concentrations. That's what I meant by just your MTHFR in quotes means the polymorphism, the result of the polymorphism, and just riboflavin means that the enzyme activity is only lower as a result of that polymorphism because of the mediocre riboflavin concentrations. So I get a lot of people that come and say, well, I'm taking riboflavin and I still have to do X. I'm taking riboflavin and I still seesaw. If I take this or that, I still get negative reactions to this, blah, 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 blah. And I very much believe that people have way deeper problems than MTHFR and they're just sticking the MTHFR label on it. And I think the testing of MTHFR is, I don't know, I think it has a proper place and I promote it, but I think the way people are using it out there is doing more harm than good, because I think that the overwhelming proportion of people in these MTHFR groups are taking a collection of deeper problems, and because they get tested for MTHFR and the MTHFR comes back, in a bad genotype, they use the genotype as a label that they smack on all their problems. So to them, MTHFR doesn't mean the rate of the MTHFR enzyme. It's a general label for all their health problems that they put Band-Aid solutions on, like these tedious distinctions between these different forms of B vitamins and stuff like that in a healthy, well-balanced system don't matter. And if people are hypersensitive to little distinctions in the type of B vitamins they're taking like this, their problem is not just MTHFR. Their problem might be related to methylation. They probably have mineral deficiencies or other genetic polymorphisms or other health problems that are, thyroid, adrenal stuff that are causing that. And the reason that MTHFR isn't simply about riboflavin for those people versus the well-controlled studies of showing that riboflavin supplementation specifically lowers homocysteine 40%, specifically in people with MTHFR C677T homozygous, specifically with poor riboflavin status. The reason their story isn't clean like the research is because MTHFR is a catch-all label for a host of other problems. And I think the protocols out there that are making all these tedious distinctions, like if you're an over-methylator, you can't take this. If you're an under-methylated, you have to take this, 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 and this. I think those are slapping Band-Aids on problems, and they're preventing people from finding what the underlying resolution of those problems is. And I think that's a really important rant that I needed to get out there Yeah. So with that preface, I'm not saying that there's no one out there who shouldn't take cyanocobalamin or shouldn't take methylcobalamin. But I am saying that if by MTHFR you literally mean the problems that are specifically a result of the polymorphism in the MTHFR enzyme that you have, then I don't think it has any implication whatsoever for whether you take cyanocobalamin or methylcobalamin. And the one thing that I would say is that some people might have a negative reaction to methylcobalamin. And if they do, that they don't have to other forms of vitamin B12, then they are profoundly hypersensitive to the supply of methyl groups in a way that absolutely cannot be explained by MTHFR unless it's a very poorly managed MTHFR, and which would be most cases of MTHFR. But I say that because, first of all, these methyl groups on the nutrients are not that significant. You put one of these molecules into your body and that methyl group is used up almost instantaneously. And then your endogenous addition of methyl groups to that molecule takes over thousands and thousands of times a day for days and days and days and days on end to that same one molecule. That one methyl group that came in is a drip in the ocean of methyl groups that will be added to that molecule in the lifetime of that molecule in your body. So if you are hypersensitive to the methyl group on the methylcobalamin that you took in, you have an extremely poorly buffered methylation system. And that could be a result of poor glycine levels. And the way that MTHFR would relate to that is that methylfolate is the off switch for the glycine buffer system. If you have low levels of methylfolate chronically, you will have chronic glycine depletion. And so if you don't have a strategy to supply the alternative methyl donor of choline, if you don't have a strategy to reduce the use of methylfolate by creatine supplementation, for example, if you don't have a strategy to chronically replete the methylfolate by getting low doses of methylfolate spread throughout the day, and if you don't replete the lost glycine, then yeah, you might have negative reactions to methylcobalamin. But when you're out there saying that over-methylators can't tolerate methylcobalamin or they get terrible reactions to this, you're slapping over-methylator label on someone whose problem is that they just don't have a rational strategy for dealing with their MTHFR, because no one is an over-methylator or an under-methylator unless it's a collection of symptoms of a poorly managed methylation system. Now, your ending question is, I have tried using sublingual methyl B12 and I couldn't make any progress in increasing my B12 levels. So I apologize for ranting for 15 minutes on something that has nothing to do with your case, but your problem is you can't get your B12 levels up. Your problem is probably that you have B12 malabsorption, and if you don't have malabsorption of everything else, you should look at the specific causes of B12 malabsorption, which are pernicious anemia and gastritis, including subclinical gastritis driven by H. pylori in the stomach. Okay, I hope the tangent I hope the tangent was useful to you and the others. Anonymous, thank you for your question. Miles Nichols says, I have a patient with a total cholesterol of 271, HDL 58, LDL 220, ApoB 139, and LP little a 172. She also has fasting glucose 109, fasting insulin 9, HbA1c of 5.9. I have a conundrum for dietary recommendation where I'm concerned about fat intake due to cholesterol levels and carb intake due to blood sugar markers. Because of her cholesterol, I've recommended a diet similar to what you recommend for familial hypercholesterolemia with the modification of higher protein, closer to 1 gram per. While I'm reading this, Miles, if you could reply to your question and tell me whether she's overweight, that would be great. Because of her cholesterol, I've recommended a diet very similar to what you recommend for familial hypercholesterolemia with the modification of higher protein, closer to 1 gram per pound of body weight, and recommended avoiding dense acellular carbs and focusing on monounsaturated fats while avoiding saturated fats. I did not recommend avoiding cholesterol from food due to research on eggs. Also, she has MTHFR, C677T, heterozygous, and homocysteine of 10. So I'm recommending that she have several eggs per week for choline. She also has ferritin of 194, but total iron of 99, and UIBC of 200, TIBC of 299. By the way, Miles, it's hard for me to, off the top of my head, because I don't deal with high volume of lab tests like you would as a medical practitioner. I often don't remember the ranges off the top of my head. So if you could put them in when you're writing these questions, it'd be helpful. Iron binding saturation, 33%. So I'm assuming ferritin may be inflammation. Any thoughts on addition or edits? Okay, let me deal with the iron first. So ferritin of 194, iron saturation 33%, assuming ferritin is from inflammation. I would say yes, but measure the serum iron and the serum transferrin in the same blood draw and use the formula to calculate the transferrin saturation, which is to multiply that by, it's in my cheat sheet, I think it's 0.79%. And the reason I say that is because there are some cases of iron overload where the iron saturation underestimates the transferrin saturation. You want to rule out that that's the case. Assuming that that's not the case and that the iron binding saturation is an adequate reflection of the transferrin saturation, and the fact that it's low normal and in the lab range, it'll be in the middle, but I consider the physiologically healthy range 30 to 40%. So it's low within the optimal range. That would indicate that the fairly highish ferritin at 194 is probably driven either by oxidative stress or inflammation. So I agree with that. But I would add not just inflammation, also oxidative stress. The Genova Oxidative Stress 2.0 panel is useful for oxidative stress, and the high sensitivity C-reactive protein would be useful as a systemic marker of inflammation. She needs to lose about 15 pounds, so overweight is probably not her main thing with insulin sensitivity, but oxidative stress causes insulin insensitivity. And so oxidative stress would be a nice explanation to tie together the high ferritin as well as the glucose problems and possibly the blood lipid problems. So I would definitely investigate oxidative stress. Fasting glucose 109, fasting insulin 9, HbA1c 5.9. So she's not like he follows up her high sensitivity CRP with 0.9. So I mean, I'm kind of like in my view, CRP is like, if that's a repeatable measure, you measure it like 3 times in a row and it's always close to 1, that could go down further. I mean, I think CRP is like the lower the better if it's chronic. But it also sounds like systemic inflammation isn't her overwhelming driver, whereas you have a big hole in your data that you have no data on oxidative stress. So, for example, the glutathione level in the blood and the cysteine to cystine ratio on the oxidative stress 2.0 panel from Genova would be a way to get a sense of the oxidative stress level in the body. So I think that would fill a very big hole in your data that you have right now. But we're like, she's not that overweight and she's not that inflamed, but her glucose also isn't that bad. I mean, it's you want to see it lower, right? But maybe having 15 pounds to lose is particularly depending on the fat distribution, especially if that's visceral abdominal fat disproportionately, maybe having 15 pounds to lose is a factor in having a moderate elevation of fasting glucose, a moderate elevation of fasting insulin. I agree those are outside of where you want to see them, but so is her body weight. So weight loss might be an important part of the puzzle. Oxidative stress that is currently uninvestigated could be an important part of the puzzle. And then I want to make an addition that I'll have to blog about the hypercholesterolemia recommendations, which is that carbohydrate. I was assuming that carbohydrate basically is acting as a PCSK9 inhibitor. I looked into it a little more deeper, and basically carbohydrate and I'm going to answer this quickly because of the time limitations and people are starting to go, but carbohydrate in the context of insulin resistance, particularly judged by high triglycerides. Do you have TGs in here? If you have TGs, I didn't see it. Particularly in the context of high triglycerides and triglycerides that go down in response to low carb, that would be a sign of the specific type of insulin resistance in the liver that I'm thinking of. In the context of insulin resistance, carbohydrate acts as a PCSK9 stimulator, which raises cholesterol, and triglycerides were less than 100. So this might not be that applicable to her, but it's worthy of attention. So in an insulin sensitive person, more carbohydrate is going to lower blood lipids. In an insulin insensitive person, more carbohydrate is going to raise them. And I think in her case, you don't have a strong case for inflammation or insulin resistance, except mildly. And particularly in that your evidence is at fasting levels. I would want to see the fasting cortisol levels too. It may, and also I would be very careful about judging the response of these markers to your recommendations about carbohydrate, because particularly for triglycerides are less than 100, she doesn't strike me as having a clear pattern of insulin resistance. And clearly if her fasting insulin and her fasting blood sugar are both a little high, clearly she has some level of insulin resistance. But what if she has high adrenal hormones in the morning that are doing that? In which case, maybe the issue here is stress management rather than carbohydrate restriction, right? So I think to really test your theory on reducing the carbs, as opposed to eating a high carb, low fat diet, I think you got to test the metrics. Like, how does she respond in these markers to the changes in carbohydrate intake? And if you can, it would be great to know at home if she tests her blood sugar. I don't know if that's if recommending that it makes sense in her case. But if you judge her as someone who's willing and able to, and it isn't going to be neurotic about looking at the numbers, if you could do an oral glucose tolerance test, I think knowing if she has a maladaptive response postprandially to glucose would be great to know, because maybe a low-fat, high-carb diet would help reduce her stress levels. Okay, summing up, I think you have evidence that inflammation is mild. I think you have evidence that overweight is mild. Mild inflammation, mild overweight are consistent with mildly negative effects on glucose. So look at getting the inflammation down, look at getting the overweight down, and see if that has an impact. Maybe that's the whole story, but either way, it's probably part of the story. You don't have any data about oxidative stress. Get the data, because it could be big. Maybe that's the big elephant in the room that we're not seeing. And you don't know, I don't remember the cortisol range off the top of my head. So I don't know how high that is, but but cortisol, and we measure cortisol, we never measure adrenaline. Like the adrenal hormones in general, like collective effect of the adrenal hormones on blood sugar in the morning is so her morning cortisol is mid-range. Probably you don't know if her 30-minute post-waking cortisol spike is mid-range, like her morning fasting in the office cortisol is. But so maybe that's not an issue. But I think oxidative stress is the big elephant in the room. I think maybe morning stress hormones, overweight, and body fat are maybe little baby elephants that we're seeing right in front of us. And I think that you just have to trial and error your way through seeing what the effects of the macros are on her blood sugar regulation. All right, thanks, Miles. Okay, CJ says, I'm having a problem with higher than usual fasting glucose. It's usually 85. Well, that's better than 110. Last 10 years, I'm now between 95 and 107. Oh, I see. Postprandial home testing seems to match the 3-hour glucose insulin done 1.5 years ago, which was excellent with sluggish pattern. So it doesn't seem to happen during the day. One time I found it went back to 85, but it was on a 15 hours or sleeping. I was exhausted due to family emergency. Do you know what has changed? Someone told me that taking vinegar the night before would cure this. I have a full autoimmune gastric ... but I have had that for many years of having a fasting level of 85. I can elaborate other details, ... We don't have time right now. I've left my hand raised. Oh, geez, I didn't see your hand. I don't see your hand raised. Other than my hand raised, not sure if that is a way to talk. Yeah, raising your hand is a way to talk, but I literally don't have you in the list of hand raised. In general, maybe you took it off. In general, if you have your hand raised and I don't see it, then feel free to put something in the chat about it. Any suggestions? Okay, let me try to summarize here. So the fasting glucose is going up to 95 to 107. Every once in a while, it goes back to 85 after a very long sleep. What caused it to change? Well, you might want to replicate the sleep effect. So it sounds like it could be as simple as stress hormones with your sleep, based on that. But it could also be that your distance from your last meal is just a lot greater on the day you slept 15 hours. So what I would do, on the basis that the only data you have about making it going down is sleep related, and on the basis that we know poor sleep compromises that, I would start tracking your sleep. Maybe getting an Oura ring and tracking your sleep quality and correlating that with your blood sugar would be a great way to start seeing if that affects your sleep. All right, sorry, I can't offer more detail than that now, but I think that's a good starting place for you, CJ. Chris Morell says, hi, Chris. Follow up from question about fatty fish I asked in AMA a couple weeks back. You mentioned the point of diminishing returns for eating salmon or similar fatty fishes 2 to 3 times a week. I should have asked, is there a point where you can eat too much fatty fish, heavy metal concerns aside? For example, is there any reason not to eat 3 to 4 ounce serving of salmon per day, perhaps for PUFA concerns, or my moderate intake of chicken, turkey, and eggs and other main protein sources keep a good ratio? I would be a little bit concerned of having fatty fish more than twice a week on the basis of the EPA. I would test that against, I would primarily test that against the omega quant and make sure that your EPA, they probably are using the AA to EPA ratio as something that you don't want to be too high. In your case, I'd want to make sure it's not too low. And look out for signs of oxidative stress. So those are 2 things that I would look at that. I don't have a firm basis I don't have an evidentiary basis to say that there's a firm line to draw. I'm drawing it at 1 to 2 a week on the basis of guesswork, and you're in guesswork zone. So, guess or test is the 2 ways to approach that. Thanks, Chris. Anonymous says, can you put on audio regarding ferritin question? Anonymous, if you want to raise your hand right now, I can put you on audio. And if you don't still want to go on audio, no worries. And actually, you have to decide that in the next 10 seconds because that's the last question. So raise your hand real quick if you want to get in. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap this up. T minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Todd Becker has the last word. Really excellent tonight. Thank you, Chris! Exclamation point. Thank you, Todd. Thank you for all the rest of the people who came on. Special thanks to Alejandra, who was courageous showing up with her face-to-face question. Hope to see some more of that in the future, and certainly welcome you all back next time. I'll let you know soon when the next AMA is going to be. And yeah, great discussion, guys. Take care.
This episode is brought to you by Ancestral Supplements. Traditional peoples, Native Americans, and early ancestral healers believed that eating the organs from a healthy animal would strengthen and support the health of the corresponding organ of the individual. For example, the traditional way of treating a person with a weak heart was to feed the person the heart of a healthy animal. Modern science makes sense of this. Heart is uniquely rich in coenzyme Q10, which supports heart health. The importance of eating organs, though, is much broader than simply matching the organ you eat to the organ you want to nourish. For example, natives of the Arctic had very limited access to plant foods and got their vitamin C from adrenal glands. And vitamin C is important to far more parts of your body than simply your adrenals. In his epic work, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, Weston Price recorded a story of natives who cured blindness using eyeballs, which are very rich in vitamin A. But now that we understand vitamin A, we know that we can get even more vitamin A by eating liver, making liver good for your eyes. Our ancestors made liberal use of organ meats both to be economical and to utilize their healing and nourishing properties. Animals in the wild do the same. Weston Price had also recorded a story of how the zoos in his era were capturing lions, tigers, and leopards, oh my, only to watch them become infertile in captivity. Researchers then observed what the lions did when they killed zebras in the wild. What they did was they went straight for the organs and bone marrow, leaving the muscle meat behind for the birds. But even the birds took what they could of the organs and bone marrow. Price reported that once the zookeepers started feeding the animals organ meats, boom, their fertility returned. The problem I often encounter, though, is that many people just don't like eating organ meats. Let's face it, if you weren't raised on them, it can be very hard to acquire a taste for them. That is where Ancestral comes in. Ancestral Supplements has a nose-to-tail product line of grass-fed liver, organ meats, living collagen, bone marrow, and more, all in the convenience of a gelatin capsule. For more information or to buy any of their products, go to ancestralsupplements.com. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. This episode is brought to you by Ample. Ample is incredible. It's a meal in a bottle that takes a total of 2 minutes to prepare, consume, and clean up. 2 minutes. I'm not kidding. Now, I know what you're thinking. Anything that quick just has to be made of synthetic ingredients that you'd have a hard time pronouncing and wouldn't want to put into your body. But it's not. Ample is made entirely from natural ingredients and designed to provide an optimal balance between protein, fat, and carbs, as well as all the vitamins and minerals that you'd need in a single meal. There's no question that it's always best to sit down and take your time eating a home-cooked meal from fresh ingredients. But let's face it, oftentimes we just don't have time for that. If you live a busy life like I do and your goal is to get things done, you need quality fuel that you can get into your system quickly. Here's a great example where Ample is perfect for me. When I shoot videos, it takes hours to set up and break down all of my equipment. So I try to get as many videos shot in a day as possible. This prevents wasting a lot of time on setup and helps me conserve big blocks of time outside of shooting videos to get into a flow state where I can research something to my heart's content and spend all the time I need thinking about it creatively and analytically. But if I spend hours dealing with recording equipment plus hours spent preparing food, eating it, and cleaning up, there's no time left over to actually shoot any videos. So on recording days, I use Ample to maximize efficiency and focus on getting things done. Ample comes in 3 versions: original, keto, and vegan. And each version comes in 2 portion sizes: 400 calorie, and 600 calorie. The 600 calorie original version gives me 37 grams of protein from a mix of grass-fed whey and collagen, which promotes satiety and flips my brain on. Its fat comes from coconut oil and macadamia nut oil. I like these oils because they're low in polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, oils that promote aging and are usually loaded into the processed foods that most people eat when they need something on the go. The coconut oil provides some medium-chain fats to keep my energy levels up, too. The carbs, the vitamins, and the minerals all come exclusively from food sources like sweet potatoes, bananas, cocoa powder, wheat and barley grass, and chlorella. It's full of natural prebiotic fibers and probiotics to promote a healthy microbiome, and the gentle sweetness comes from a mix of honey, monk fruit, and stevia. I just mix it with water, drink it, rinse out the bottle, and boom. 2 minutes in, and I'm fully fueled and ready to face the next phase of the day. I first came across Ample when I met its founder and CEO, Connor Young, at PaleoFX a few years ago. Connor inspired me with his vision for Ample, which I anticipate will be much more than a meal in a bottle in the near future. I've become an official advisor to Ample, and I'll be helping Ample design scientific research that will lead both to an ever-improving Ample and, I hope, meaningful contributions to our understanding of how to use nutrition to help people be healthier and happier and perform better at the challenges that they care most about. As a listener to the Mastering Nutrition podcast, I've also worked out a special deal for you. If you use the discount code CHRIS15, you'll get 15% off your first order of Ample. To get your discount, go to amplemeal.com. That's amplemeal.com, 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 and use the code CHRIS15 at checkout.
Thank you so much for watching, everybody. If you would like to participate in the next Ask Me Anything, you can join the CMJ Masterpass at chrismasterjohnphd.com/masterpass/mastering-nutrition. Using that URL or using the link in the description of this episode will get you a 10% lifetime discount off the program. You not only get to participate in regular Ask Me Anythings live over Zoom when you are a Masterpass member, but you also get transcripts of these episodes. You get them ad-free, and you get them as they are produced instead of as they are released, often getting them weeks or months ahead of time. You can sign up again at chrismasterjohnphd.com/masterpass/mastering-nutrition. Whether you're on the Masterpass or not, you can always find me at chrismasterjohnphd.com, and you can find me at Chris Masterjohn on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. All right, I hope you found this useful. Signing off, this is Chris Masterjohn of chrismasterjohnphd.com. This has been Mastering Nutrition, and I will see you in the next episode.